Um, cool. Well, we'll go ahead and dive into urban composting. So, if anyone heard the Koja show that we were on the other day, like I was on it, Meredith from Love and Carrots and Kendra from City Blossoms. One of the questions was like, will gardens attract rats? And I think it's really important because there is some misunderstanding around that. One is like gardens don't attract rats. It's not like if you build a garden, all of a sudden you're going to have rats in the neighborhood. But if you already do have rats, there's a chance you could attract those rats to your garden. And that's really important distinction. Like, if you just, do a garden and don't compost, don't have dumpsters near your garden or anything like that, it's a very low chance you're going to have any rats. I mean, you'll have squirrels and birds and things, but not rats. But if you have a garden that's close to like alleyways and dumpsters, and things like that, there are things that you have to be careful and intentional because you could attract those rats to your garden, and they're not going to be attracted because they smell. I mean, rats love like sweet potatoes and squashes and stuff. They'll eat that stuff, but they're not attracted to that stuff. They're not just going to be like, if you plant some sweet potatoes, they're going to run to your garden. What they are going to be attracted to is if you have a bad compost pile, like mainly like rotting food smells, is what attracts rats. That's why it's really important to be very intentional about composting. We're going to talk about a lot of different ways to be intentional today. We'll talk about different options too. Like you don't need to just go, crazy on composting. There's a lot of different alternatives. And if you're feeling like, I don't want to scare people, but also if you're feeling just like overwhelmed, that's one of the reasons why we started like the compost cooperative network where we have 56 different compost sites around the city. And these like rat proof and critter proof compost bins, and you can actually learn and there's about 1,500 people participating. You can learn with people, you can compost, it's a great way to kind of learn about it and then maybe like build your own compost bin at your home. Or there's other ways like DPW farmers market. They have a farmers market compost pickup where they contract compost cab. It's one market per ward. And I know the farmers markets just had a hiccup last week because a lot of them weren't really, I don't know. I mean, at least it sounded like a lot of them weren't really practicing a lot of social distance precautions. So the mayor, temporarily closed them down, and they had to like reapply to get, demonstrating that they can actually maintain social distancing during the market. And from what I've heard, a lot of them have already got their essential status back. Like all the fresh farmers markets, which is like the majority of the markets in DC, got their status back. As long as those markets are open, you can take your compost to them and drop them off for free. And you just go to Zero Waste DC, and there's a link somewhere in there where you can find which markets are open. But I mean, that's another option. I know Mom's Organic, the grocery store, they have this awesome recycling center right when you walk in. It's got, you can recycle jeans, light bulbs, batteries, but they also have free, food scrap compost. So there are other options. And then there's a lot of there's a lot easier options too if you want to do like worm bins and stuff. So we'll talk all about that. And also you can also compost without using food scraps too. But if you are going to do food scraps in compost systems in your yard, we're going to talk about a lot of different ways to do it intentionally and properly. We'll go ahead and get started. But I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. I don't want to scare anyone from composting, but at the same time, I want you to just be intentional about it. And if you're not ready for your yard composting, there's a lot of different options as you start, learning and getting more ready. Cool. So we'll go ahead and get started. So urban composting. So we're going to talk about today what is compost, the science behind composting. We'll talk about best practices for urban environments. I think a lot of best practices for composting has been developed in non-urban settings, in like farms and commercial spaces. So we're just now developing our best practices for in urban areas where rats are a big deal. Talk about alternative composting systems, vermicompost, compost tea, and then if we have time, we'll go over some just like quick safety tips. So what is compost? So a lot of people think, compost is soil. Compost isn't soil. It's actually amendment that you add to soil. Soil is something that's developed over a long period of time. Like I'm guessing like hundreds or thousands of years, where just like rocks and things just break down and create this like great, structure for the plants that can suck up nutrients and stuff if it's the right conditions. But a lot of times it lacks, soil structure where you can't get, water can't get in, or it lacks retention, so water, it doesn't hold on to water or nutrients. A lot of times it lacks organic matter. So that's why it's important that we add amendments to our soil every year to kind of just build up that, that retention, that fertility, soil structures. So that's what we're adding. Compost is an organic amendment that we add to soil that just improves our growing capacity, and something that we need to add every year. Like fertilizers and all that stuff, you don't really, you can get away without doing, but compost is something that you should definitely at least add, even if it's just like one bag of compost a year. Just mix that into your soil, because that's going to improve the soil nutrients. It's going to also improve a lot of the healthy soil biology. That is a really great class. We're going to have a class this summer about soil biology, and it's really important to understand like the just like the benefits of that, healthy biology. A lot of times, there'll be like nutrients that that's in your soil, but it's not in the plant accessible form. And don't quote me on this, but I'm just guessing, but if you have like NO3, which is like a type of nitrogen, a plant can't suck that up, but some bacteria eats it down, breaks it down, and turns it into NO2. Then all of a sudden, some plants can suck up that nitrogen. And don't quote me on the NO2, and NO2, but more about the idea is just like there's nutrients that are in different forms, and a lot of times they're not in plant accessible forms. But having healthy biology will break that stuff down and actually allow a more fertilization in your garden. It also helps with retention. So a lot of times if you have too sandy of soil, if you add compost, it will hold on to the water and nutrients. Remember, the difference between sand and clay is just the particle size. So if you have really big particles like sand, when they compact together, there's a lot of porosity, a lot of spaces. And so it's just hard, things just like flush through it. It doesn't, retain. But if you have, really small particles like clay, and you mix those together, compact that, and then there's no air spaces, and then water and nutrients, it has plenty of nutrients, but it's hard for plants to get in there and to get oxygen. So adding compost to either, sandy or clay soil will help out. It adds retention to sandy soil, and it actually adds porosity to clay soil. So start opening up some clay soils, allow the biology to start breaking things down, making it more aerable soil. So it improves that soil structure. It prevents soil erosion. So compost, think about compost as like this gummy thing that you're putting into your soil, and it's going to hold things together and prevent, soil from, eroding during like, rainstorms and things like that. It helps remediate soil, so certain toxins. There's a lot of studies right now about remediation in soils. A lot of toxins and things will actually, like the healthy biology will actually break it down into forms that aren't toxic anymore. So over time, this is a slow and long process, but over time, adding compost will break down bad things into your soil and make it more healthy. And then I think the coolest thing is it helps balance the pH. So if you're just a little bit off, or if you want to like grow, blueberries that need more acidic soil, but you're at like, 6%, 6 on pH scale, adding compost will creates a buffer zone that actually allows things that like, pH, a little bit off the pHs will help buffer that, so they'll get along. You can't, if your soil is really acidic or really alkaline, it's not going to really help. But if it's just a little bit off, adding a lot of compost will help, bridge that gap. And then because as we talked in previous classes, having the right balance of pH, anywhere between 5.5 and 7 on the pH scale from acidity to alkaline, having that right balance allows plants to better soak up nutrients and things like that. So why compost? There's a couple different reasons. One is when you send your organic waste to the dump, what happens is so this is a diagram of a dump. They just dig a big hole, they throw all our trash, organic stuff and non-organic stuff, into this hole, and then they cover it with a layer, and it creates this anaerobic situation. We'll talk more about anaerobic versus aerobic. Anaerobic is there's no oxygen, and then aerobic is there is oxygen. But in anaerobic, anaerobic, it actually breaks things down. It attracts these typically, sometimes anaerobic is good, like fermentation and making cheeses and beers, but most of the time, anaerobic is very bad. It's where we, cause diseases and things and pathogens, and a lot of times that fertility in that organic matter gets broken down and then shot up into air, as greenhouse gases, like, methanes and sulfurs and things like that. So, so there's these vents, so they seal this up, and then all anaerobic bacteria breaks everything down, and then it releases all kinds of greenhouse gases. So sending our organics to the dump is a big cause of greenhouse gases, a big cause of climate change and things like that. So we want to find different ways to handle this this organic matter rather than just like throwing it into the dump and sending it air. So one is good for the environment. Two, a lot of times if you ever notice, like if you had a garden for a while and you're not composting, but you have a lot of like organic waste in gardens, it just sits in these piles. Sometimes that pile will stay for years before it really breaks down, because just like a normal pile, we'll talk about this, but like later, but a normal carbon pile just takes forever to break down. You need to add nitrogen to kind of attract the right bacteria. They break it all down. So having these giant brush piles, in your yard is just, it's okay, temporarily, but if they're there for years, rodents are just going to make it into habitat. So we want to, find quicker ways to break this material down, and then composting will help that. And the last thing is just like, we know, everyone needs to add compost every year to their garden, and it could be a big cost. If you have your home garden, buying, a couple bags of compost is not too bad. But like, our community gardens, I managed a community 200-person community garden, and that was our biggest expenditures. We would buy a giant dump truck, of compost, from real far away, and there'd be huge carbon footprint, bringing that, compost down. It'd be our biggest expenditure, and then we would, but we that's what really pushed us. This was about a decade ago. It pushed us to develop these urban composting practices and systems and things, and now we're actually at that garden makes majority of the compost themselves through these systems that we're going to talk about. So it can save you a lot of money as well. And then it's really important to understand that, like I was saying earlier, that so we created all these standards over the last couple of decades, all these best practices around composting. But what we found recently is all those that were based on industry standards. And like if you're a giant composting facility, your standards and your best practices are going to be completely different than if you're just composting in your backyard, or if you're composting as a community, with volunteers. So it's really important to understand, like, a lot of these practices that we've been teaching for a while should not be done in urban environments and community environments. And that's like, for example, if you're a commercial composter, your main concern is just the quality of your compost. You're not concerned about rats and smell so much as just like making high quality compost, which in the urban environment, people care way more about rats, especially in DC, where there's more rats than people. We care way more about rats than we do about creating compost. So in the urban environment, rats are the biggest concern. Let's make sure we don't attract rats, and then worry about our quality of compost. A lot of the industry standards are based on private industries who can actually pay full-time workers to spend a lot of time taking temperatures and turning the compost and all this stuff. And we don't have that in the urban settings. They're mainly community, they're mainly volunteer or cooperative run. So it's really important to not over burn out your labor. You're not paying these people. So if your compost system is based on one person killing themselves every year, which a lot of systems are, it's going to eventually fail when that person gets sick or moves away or something. So it's important to develop decent systems that aren't going to burn people out. Like industry standards, they do a lot of math, calculating compost, different ratios and things like that, and that's great, but you just can't do that in urban settings. It's going to be more about sensory, more about like smelling and feeling and things like that, instead of like, we don't have giant scales to measure our wheelbarrows and things like that. And the biggest difference though is all of our composts, on industry standards, like all of our composts, all the materials that you use when they compost happens all at once. They have three dump trucks full of like carbon material and one dump truck full of nitrogen. They mix it all at once. With our systems, you're never going to have all that material that you need, because in order to actually have a decent compost pile, and we'll talk about this later, you need to have a certain size, like at least 3 foot tall pile to properly compost. And that's going to take some if it's in your backyard or if it's in it's a community garden, that's going to take months to build up that material. So we have to kind of develop different practices to kind of build up our piles before we can start actually doing like what the industry does. So just understand that there are different if you've taken compost classes in the past, there may be some conflicting things, but just understand like urban composting is something that we're still developing the best practices and still learning. And I'd be worried of anyone that says they know it, they're an expert in urban composting and they know everything, just because I've been in the urban compost field for over a decade now, and we're still learning things as we go. So cool. So now let's start talking about actual composting now, and get away from all my disclaimers. So there's a lot of different ways to compost. What we're mainly going to be talking about today, most of today, is we're going to talk about hot composting or like active composting or bacterial composting, and that's mainly you mix a bunch of ingredients together, carbon, nitrogen, water, and air. If you mix it just right, you're going to attract this beneficial bacteria that's going to come in and just start eating the stuff down, and then they're going to poop out this really great compost amendment that you can eventually put back in your garden. It's a really great system. The bacteria actually has heat, so the more bacteria you attract, the hotter the piles get, and you can actually monitor the temperatures. And if you're doing a really good job, you can actually see like steam coming out of your piles. And then like really big piles, because the bigger the piles, the more heat you can attract. And really big piles can, in industry levels, like at compost facilities, can actually catch on fire. They have to be very careful dealing with like large piles. But a lot of people like this bacterial composting. Just a heads up, you're not going to catch your pile in your home or your community garden on fire. I mean, we're talking huge piles to get that. But a lot of people like this because it's a very efficient and very quick way to compost a lot of material at once. But then what we will be talking about other ways, later in the presentation, we'll be talking about mainly what we call cold composting. So this doesn't really, deal with like the bacteria. You're not attracting bacteria. You're mainly finding other ways to break down composting. Like probably the best way out there, the best compost you can have is a vermicompost or compost that's made from worms. They have this amazing probiotic bacteria in their stomachs. So when they eat your food scraps and poop out, your compost, it's the most amazing compost ever. And we'll talk a lot about that later. BSFL is black soldier fly larva. So if you ever had a compost pile and it looks like there's a bunch of maggots everywhere, chances are that's actually a black soldier fly larva. And they're actually really great composters. And we'll talk about that. Talk about just like burying compost, keyhole gardens, fermentation compost like bokashi, and different like carbon piles and things like that. But for now, let's go ahead and just kind of dive into hot composting or bacterial composting. And like I said, this is all about, doing a right kind of mixture of ingredients that attracts beneficial bacteria, comes in, eats up all your, stuff, poops out great compost, and then you can put it back in the garden. I love this composting because it's a very forgiving composting as long as you're, monitoring it and checking on it. It's not one of those you can just kind of walk away. You want to like, be monitoring it, but it's also, if you like mess up, which a lot of times why people mess up is like they'll get too wet and it doesn't have drainage or things like that, and so all the water gets into the compost and pushes out the oxygen and then makes it anaerobic. And when it's anaerobic, meaning like there's no oxygen in your compost pile, that's when bad bacteria or anaerobic bacteria come in and they start eating up all your food scraps, and then instead of pooping out compost, they poop out methane and sulfurs and stuff and greenhouse gases, which is not only bad for the environment, but also that's your fertility that you want to get back into your soil, and now that's that's being released into our atmosphere. So but what I love about composting is it's a forgiving process. Like if that ever happens, you just gotta maybe give it some drainage, put some carbon on it, mix it up again, air it out a little bit, and then that bad bacteria will go away, and then the good bacteria will come right back. So it's not like you're killing bacteria, you're just like you're just going attracting good bacteria and attracting bad. So it's just it's a very forgiving process. So if it ever gets like a smelly, just we'll talk about different things to do, but the four things about, four ingredients that you need to understand with composting is green or nitrogen material. So the brown or carbon material. So all things have, most organic things that I know of have at least, nitrogen and carbon, but some things have a lot more nitrogen, like, green grass. And then some things have a lot more carbon, like, like straw, after the grass has been dried out, and then you have, a lot of that nitrogen escapes, and then you have straw. So that's what we mean when I say greens. I don't just mean things that are just 100% nitrogen. I'm saying things that have more nitrogen than carbon, and browns are more carbon than nitrogen. And then water and oxygen. So this bacteria needs water to survive, but if it gets too much water, it pushes out the oxygen, and then that bacteria goes away. So how that looks is so green material. So this is our nitrogen material. So this is like the most important part of actual real composting, bacterial composting, because again, if you just have a giant pile of just carbon yard waste, all like leftover garden waste that's just dried out, and it's just like very carbon heavy, that could take years to break down. I always talk about the example of the PG County Yard Waste Facility. They pick up a lot of street leaves. And then they compost them all, and make what's called leaf grow, which is a compost. It's a generic cheap compost, but it's still a good, high organic matter compost that you can find in most garden stores. Maryland Environmental Service, does it. You can actually order it in bulk for somewhat, it's kind of cheaper than most composts. But it takes them about 10 to 12 months to make that leaf grow compost, just by mixing it and watering it and all that stuff of just leaves. And they started this food scrap program where they're actually introducing food scraps into that. And food scraps and nitrogen, bacteria love nitrogen. They're not a big fan of carbon, but the composting bacteria really like nitrogen. So what nitrogen does is it attracts all this beneficial bacteria, and then they start eating the nitrogen and the carbon. They start making all these temperatures, and then they start breaking things down a lot faster. And now they're making leaf grow in like 3 to 4 months. So that's really like what we're trying to do. We're trying to take that big carbon pile that's just going to sit there for years, and we want to break that down in a couple months and have finished compost. So that in order to do that, we have to introduce sources of nitrogen. And like I said, not everyone's ready for food scraps, and things like that could attract rodents. So I'm going to talk about different options of nitrogen. I'm going to talk about things that can attract rats, and things that won't attract rats. So the things that mainly what I recommend, if you want to try to do some food scrap composting, the main thing you're looking for is like raw vegetable and fruit scraps. We'll talk more about like cooked and stuff. You can do a little bit of cooked food, but you want to stay mainly away from food, cooked foods and meats and dairies and stuff, because they can get smelly, they can attract animals, they can cause pathogens. What we mainly do is a pathogen prevention approach, where we mainly just focus on organic stuff that's not likely going to build any kind of pathogen and stuff. And really, like with pathogens, even if you throw some chicken bones and stuff in there, and you build some pathogens, a lot of times if you just let that stuff's going to eventually break down into the soil. I think a lot of people overreact and get scared about that. So, but that stuff will all break down eventually when you incorporate it into your soil. But in the meantime, it can attract some you can have smells and stuff. So that's why we want to kind of avoid a lot of that stuff. But like coffee grounds is really great. I know a lot of people add coffee grounds directly to their soil. It is a little bit acidic. I wouldn't like a lot of people swear by it, and that's fine. But it's going to be breaking down into your soil, and it's just a lot better to add it to your compost, break it down first, and then add it to your soil. Tea bags, remove those little staples, and beware of those like fancy tea bags now. They're made out of poly bags. Don't compost those. And the only dairy I recommend composting is eggshells. Even though it takes, they probably won't break down your compost. It takes a while to break down, really break down eggshells. But as they're breaking down, they leach calcium. So it's a great source of calcium. for blossom end rots and things like that. So I've definitely add that. I would just wash the eggs first, get that yolk out, and then kind of crush them if you can, the best you can, and mix it. But you'll see, like in your finished compost, you'll see a lot of still eggshells, and that's great. Your garden's gonna love eggshells. And then if you're just not ready for food scraps yet, think about other sources of nitrogen that you can use. Like you can use fresh leaves. A lot of times, whether something's a green or brown, like a heavy in nitrogen or heavy in carbon, is when you get to it. So if I have if I cut my grass, that grass is, if you ever smell a bag of fresh grass, I mean, that's very high in nitrogen. You can smell that, ammonias and methanes and stuff just coming out of that bag. But if I let that dry out for a while and get more of like a straw material, a lot of that nitrogen escapes, and then it becomes more of a carbon. So that's true of a lot of plant waste. If you pull a lot of green plant waste, that may be more high in nitrogen, but if you let it just kind of dry out for a sec, for like a week, that's going to become a carbon source. So fresh leaves and fresh garden waste. Flowers are really great, and even hair, which I thought was kind of crazy when I first read about that. But I actually talked to a lot of people, especially with like dogs that shed a lot. They'll compost their dog hair. It does take. I've tried it a little bit. It does take a little while. You may have to go send it through the system, compost system a couple times, but it is a great source of nitrogen. So it can be used. So we have a couple questions. Can we put in weeds for the seed? Yeah, we'll talk about weeds. You want to be careful with weeds. If it's gone to seed, I probably wouldn't compost it. I would just throw it away, or you can put it in a black trash bag, hang it in the sun for like a month, and it'll like microwave whatever's in there, and then you can compost it. But yeah, if you have like things, you're going to throw some seeds in there, like like squash seeds and tomato seeds and things, and some of those may survive, and you may have little volunteers, which is kind of cool. Avocado pits are going to start sprouting in your compost bin. That's like a perfect environment to germinate avocado pits. So that's that stuff's fine, but like you don't want to throw a whole bunch of weed seeds in there. So really, when it comes to weeds, well, one, I would make sure if it's a ribosome spreading, like a crabgrass, don't throw crabgrass in there. Don't throw nut sage. You throw those in the trash, because if any little part of that root survives, it's going to start spreading around. But everything else, I would go for it. Yeah, I would, I compost all my weeds, as long as I just make sure they're not in seeds or they're not like Bermuda grass. Does this include banana peels, avocado peels, and pits? Yeah, this bananas, avocado peels, pits are all fantastic. Any kind of raw vegetable or fruit scrap, banana peels are great, but anything, that's a vegetable or fruit, feel free to throw in there. Can we put in weeds before they seed? Yeah, definitely. And does drying out include freezing? Yeah, so a lot of people, we'll talk about storage, because you're not going to be, every time you cook a meal, you're not going to be walking down to your compost pit. You need to have a place to kind of store it, and then like maybe once a week or every other day walk down. So one way, if you have freezer space, that's like the best way to store it, and that will dry it out a little bit. But I'm going to talk about better ways to dry out your carbon, because that's the hardest part about this. Is actually, like, it's actually easy finding green material, nitrogen. The hardest part is actually finding carbon. That's a little bit more difficult, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. What about cooked eggshells? For sure, cooked eggshells is fine. Just wash them a little bit, and then try to crush them, or if you can, or cool. All right. And then there's certain things that are really high in nitrogen, which are great. You just want to be a little bit more intentional, just about how you when you're mixing them with the carbon. You don't like manure is great. Manure may attract rodents, especially like chicken poop and stuff like that. But for the most part, like horse manure, they're not going to be attracted for that. And like we have really great sources of horse manure, organic manure. You really want to make sure it's organic, because a lot of times horse stables will use pesticides and herbicides on their grass that they feed to on the horse feed, and then the horse eat them. They survive our stomachs, and they're persistent. They survive composting, and then you're putting herbicides in your garden. But if you want to be 100% sure, national parks, NPS is National Park Service, They have 2 horse stables in DC. They're 100% organic. They have to be organic. One's in Rock Creek and one's in DuPont. This is a great source if you're just not getting good temperatures and you're not, having trouble composting. Go out and just, you can go out anytime. It's good to call ahead, but go, you can just fill up some buckets and then like slowly mix that, into your compost. But the thing about manure is you never want to mix fresh manure into your garden because it's too heavy of nitrogen. It's going to actually burn your plants a little bit, the roots. But you either want to compost it or you want to let it sit in the pile for a year. It's called aging it. So that's really great. But then also, if you're cutting your grass, bag that grass. That grass has just as much nitrogen as that manure. These are really high sources of manure. And then I don't know why I always put alfalfa. I don't know anyone that has alfalfa bales, but I mean it's mainly something that you feed to horses and stuff because it's high in protein and things like that. But that's a really high source of nitrogen. So if you want, these are great things, but you don't need these things. These are just to kind of like kickstart your compost if you need to. But you just want to be a little bit more intentional as opposed to food scraps. You just throw whatever food scraps and don't think too much about that. Another question: how long to age the manure I get from University of Maryland? Well, if it's fresh, yeah, you got to let it. If you're not going to compost it, you got to let it sit in the pile for at least a year, and then once it's aged, it'll stop, steaming and won't be hot, and it'll be more like a soil amendment. It'll be more like compost, and not less like manure. So you definitely want to age that for a year. But if you can compost it, you can also put it in your compost bin, and depending on your compost situation, you can have a ready manure. You can compost it down in a couple months and then add it to your garden. All right, and then your carbon. So this is really the most important part, and it's also unfortunately one of the harder parts of composting is finding enough of carbon to cover your nitrogen. Because your nitrogen, your food scraps and things, that's what's going to attract rodents. That's going to cause smells and things like that. But mixing it with a proper amount of carbon is going to cover up the smells. It's going to keep things in check. It's going to prevent from attracting rodents and pathogens and stuff. So it's really important to have a decent amount of carbon, ground material, but at the same time, this is really hard sometimes. I mean, we have these surges, like when the leaves fall, leaves make great carbon sources. When school's in session, you can get like shredded paper from schools and stuff. And in like plant, whenever people into the planting season, there'll be a lot of carbon at garden sources. But a lot of times it's hard. And it's one of these things, if you don't have enough carbon, you just need to shut down your compost. You can't continue to compost if you don't have enough carbon. But carbon is basically like your organic matter. It's high in carbon. It's something you want to like mix it really well with your nitrogen to, prevent smells. It will prevent attracting rodents. And that could be our biggest source. All 56 of our compost cooperative sites are at gardens because that's the main source of carbon is plant waste that's coming out. Sometimes you have to dry that plant waste for a couple of weeks just to get it into a carbon, but a lot of that is our main source. Also dried leaves, especially if you can shred it. If you have a lawnmower with bag, shred your leaves first, because shredded leaves are fantastic, but non-shredded leaves, I mean, they can kind of mat and get wet and cause little anaerobic pockets and stuff. So you want to shred if possible. Wood chips are great. Sawdust and wood shavings, as long as you're avoiding any kind of pressure treated wood. So again, that pressure treated wood is that a green tinted wood. It's copper. Copper is a fungicide, and you don't want to be throwing a bunch of fungicide into your compost when you need that biology to kind of break things down. Straw, remember straw, hay's for horses, straws for people. Hay is like a wild field of grass. They cut it all down and it's got seeds and stuff because they want seeds because it's high in protein, because it's an animal feed for the horses. And straw is like a farm grain like barley where they cut the tops off and there'll be a little bit of seeds left, but it's mainly just stalks. But mainly when you go Home Depot and garden centers and you see the straw bales, that's usually straw. Hay is usually these giant, big bales, but it's good to ask first. And then you can always get straw from construction sites and stuff, but you definitely want to ask and make sure that straw wasn't there like soaking up toxic runoff or anything like that. It was just like used for like a spacing or crowd control or something. And then like, like a lot of, schools and stuff will have, big, like garden days and stuff, and they'll bring straw bales out. And that's a great source to get, extra straw. Newspaper is really great. Most paper, most generic paper in this country is soy ink, like newspapers and typical stuff that you use. It's mainly when you get fancier, things like glossy paper. Glossy is like a clay-based. You can still compost it, but it just does not compost very well. So I would avoid glossy things. Really fancy like magazines and fancy like color paper. The fancier the ink is, the more likely it might have some toxic stuff in it. So just want to do like generic, black and white or generic, color paper. Works great. But you really want to rip that up into little pieces. If you have a shredder, that's great. Shredded paper is fantastic carbon source. That's a big one that we supplement to a lot of our compost cooperatives. Dryer lint, if you're not using any like scents or dyes or anything in any of your laundry processes. Seashells, that sounds like crustaceans and stuff that, like you do a crab bake or clam bake and you have all these like leftover shells. It takes a little bit of process. You just don't want to throw a bunch of smelly seashells into your compost. You want to either, like, if you have a fire pit, have a fire and throw all of them in there to sanitize it, or you could boil them and you can actually use that water as a seafood broth, or bake them in your oven and make it a little smelly. And then you take that, sanitized shells, and then you put them in the bag and like kind of pulverize them, crush them with like a hammer, which sounds crazy. Like it sounds like a lot of work, but the thing is like seashells is like the most amazing micronutrient for your garden. So if you do this and go through the process and mix it really well in compost, you're going to have like really happy plants. It's amazing fertilizer to get back in your garden. It just takes a little work. And then wood ash, if you have like a fire pit and you're not using lighter fluid or any kind of like starter log, if you're just naturally starting your fires with like some paper and some twigs and stuff, that stuff's a really great source of phosphorus, which is a macronutrient. It's really great for your garden. But the thing is like the best thing about carbon is like you don't want to just use one source, because a lot of times it'll get like kind of matted and anaerobic. You want to kind of mix as many different things as possible, like mix plant waste with wood chips and straw and shredded paper. Like if you just fill a whole bin full of shredded paper, it's going to get wet and nasty and stuff. But if you mix that shredded paper with like some leaves and things, you're going to have a much better kind of compost. So I definitely recommend trying to, like, if you're composting, like you just need to get in that mode where you're constantly looking for, carbon sources, like whether at your office that's shredding paper, or a lot of times people will put those brown paper bags of yard waste in their front house. And sometimes, I know they're getting better about it, but a lot of times those would end up in the dump. I think our DPW has a waste diversion team that's really working on trying to capture that and compost it. But a lot of times, like, I have more confidence of composting that stuff locally than hoping that it ends up somewhere to be composted. So a couple of questions. What about store-bought compost for Home Depot? Yeah, if it's store-bought, it's from an industry. They're under industry standards, so they have to monitor it. They have to, ensure there's no pathogens. They have to ensure that everything was done right. So that's why if you buy store-bought compost, it's fantastic. You don't have to worry about anything. It's good compost. There's a lot of regulations making sure that that's a healthy compost. It's just that you just have to pay for it, and there comes a carbon footprint on that stuff too, because it has to be shipped around. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with store-bought compost, and there's different layers, like leaf grow is more of a cheaper one. There's a lot of mushroom, like Pennsylvania grows most of our mushrooms. They have huge mushroom farms, and they grow them out of wood and leaf shavings and stuff like that, or like wood shavings, and a lot of that stuff will eventually break down, and then they make a compost out of that. You can usually find mushroom compost at most centers, and that's usually like $1 a bag. So that stuff's great. It's just like basic organic matter. And then there's like really pricey stuff. Like there's a company up in Maine that breaks down like lobster shells and stuff into the compost, and that's an amazing compost. But it's just like it's $10 a bag. So it's really up to you how much you want to spend. And if you can buy bulk, if you can throw in with your neighbors and buy bulk, that makes things so much cheaper. So a couple of things. I have lots of leaves for carbon. My problem is knowing which grass clippings are okay, not with bad pesticides. Yeah, because a lot of people will spray their grasses for different things, like for weeds, or they'll spray it with like mosquito stuff. So you definitely want to be aware, of where you're get, what sources you're getting this from. So if you're using fresh grass and stuff, you want to make sure it doesn't have pesticides. So it's good to research a little bit about that stuff. I started composting last fall using leaves. How long will it take to break down? Leaves can take a while, especially if you're just doing straight leaves. If you shred them with your lawnmower or a weed whacker or something, and you add water and water them once a week, they'll break down a lot quicker. Or if you add some nitrogen sources, but it will take. It could take like a year or so, to really break down. Can I usually use my College Park compost that I get 2 years ago? It has been covered, or use new compost? Yeah, compost doesn't go bad. It's still good. Sometimes if it gets like too wet and just sitting and it sits around soaking for a while, it can get anaerobic. But again, you just dry it out, mix it up a little bit, and all the bad bacteria will go away, and then good bacteria will come back. Yeah, compost doesn't go bad, but what it does is it breaks down every year even more. That's why I used to fill my garden beds with my raised beds with half compost, half topsoil, which plants love that. But then every year it's like I have to refill half the bed. So now I fill it completely up with topsoil, and then I just add a couple bags of compost, and then that works a lot better. But yeah, compost is good for forever, from what I know, until it breaks down. What's wrong with meat and compost? I heard conflicting stuff on this, like ground is the best place to put that back in. Yeah, problem with meat, a couple things. One is it could, build some pathogens, but mainly it smells. It's going to be smell. It's going to get putrid, and it's going to attract, rodents and things. Like, remember, rats are attracted to rotting smells, and meats and dairies are really great at producing rotting smells. So if you want to, so a great way to prevent that is just avoid all meats and dairies. We'll talk a little bit about what you can and can't use. What about rotten fruit, veggies that fall off the ground? For sure, yeah, things that are rotting, actually you want to get those off the ground and get them into compost bins and properly mix them so they don't actually smell and attract rodents. For sure, yeah, definitely. And how about old Christmas tree branches? Yeah, for sure. Christmas trees are fine. The pine needles are somewhat acidic, but it's not going to be that big of a deal. To really change the acidity of your garden, you would have to add like pine needles for like decades. So it's fine. I know like DPW, they pick up all the Christmas trees, and they actually break them down and compost them, and then bring them back. Like a free source of compost, if you're looking for free kind of generic compost, our DPW Department of Public Works, they collect all of our leaves and Christmas trees and stuff, and they send them out to Pogo Organic, which is a tree nursery, and then they spend a couple months breaking it down, and then they bring it back to Fort Totten, which is one of our transfer stations in Brooklyn, and you can actually pick that stuff up. Sometimes it's more like mulch; it's not completely broken down. Sometimes they don't screen it, so they could have shredded plastic bags and stuff in there. So you gotta kind of screen it yourself a little bit. But but most people don't mind. A lot of people use that in their organic gardens, and it's fine. Or a lot of people will just use it as like tree mulch and stuff, and for ornamentals. But yeah, for sure. Topsoil comes in bags and seems hard like clay. There must be different kinds of topsoil. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it shouldn't be clay. I mean, it's definitely it's thicker than normal compost. So if you're getting topsoil, I don't know if there's different grades or not. I usually just buy the cheapest topsoil I can, and that seems to be fine. But I mean, that's why you always want to kind of if you fill a garden bed full of topsoil, you always want to buy a couple bags of compost and just mix that in, and that should make it a lot more fluffier. Sorry, I missed an answer to rotten fruit and veggies that fall off a plant. Yeah, compost those for sure. You want to get those in the compost bin and cover them with carbon so they don't smell and attract rodents. And that stuff's really great to compost. All right. So carbon sources, as as I said earlier, it's really hard to find. This is their biggest problem. Sometimes you'll be drowning in carbon, and then the next month you're desperate looking for carbon. So a couple possible places. There's tree service companies that will dead trees, dying trees. They'll chop them up and grind them up, and then they'll leave you with wood chips. So there's a couple of great. There's a new app getchipdrop.com. When I first saw this, I was like, no way. Like, that's not going to work. I've actually talked to a lot of people who've gotten wood chips. They coordinate with different local wood chip companies and get them to drop off a load for free at your house. And same with DDOT, DC Department of Transportation has an urban wood reuse program, which they started out just with schools where they'll drop off wood chips and tree stumps and with schools, but now you can actually place orders for your gardens. But it does take a little while, so you have to be patient. And then you can also just directly reach out to different tree companies. I have a whole list of tree companies at this link. You could just email them and just ask. A lot of times, it helps them out sometimes, like, cause if they have a big job and they'll have to drive back and forth to, like, if they're like, a lot of people will take them to Vienna and they'll sell them, to like different places that will turn them into compost. But that's like, it could be like half your day driving back and forth. So a lot of times they're pretty happy to have a local place to drop off their wood scraps. I said, well, a lot of times you gotta be super nice about it. But if you see, a tree service truck outside of your house that's cutting down a tree, you can usually approach them and just ask if you can have those wood chips. And a lot of times they'll give you those wood chips. There's some mills, especially there's one in Anacostia that does process non-pressure treated wood, and they'll give you like sawdust and stuff from that. Paper shredding companies, a lot of companies, they're liable for it, so they have to like burn they can't recycle or compost it. But some of them can, or if you get that stuff in your office before the company picks it up, like that's why we shred paper at DC Parks and Rec, and I'll grab that stuff and compost it at a lot of different sites. Landscapers, you just want to be careful. You want to know and have a relationship with these landscapers, or else they're going to drop off big bags of like poison ivy and stuff and thorns. So, but garden waste, like I said, is the main source of carbon that we get. But the biggest one is just like, just constantly be in that mode where you're looking for carbon as you're like walking around the neighborhood and just grabbing stuff at bags as you see it and things like that. But it's good to know if you're going to order a load. A lot of these dump trucks, they come between like 5 to 10 cubic yards. So a good sense, like this is this is like broken down mulch, but it's going to be a pretty similar pile with wood chips. So if you you could get anywhere between a couple cubic yards to up to like 10 cubic yards. So just know if you're ordering this, a lot of times they can't predict how much they're going to have. So you can have a small pile or a big pile. So you want to make sure that you can handle at least a 10 cubic yard if you're going to order it. But cool. And then surface area is a big one. So with these nitrogen and carbon sources, you want to chop them up as small as possible because it allows more surface area, which allows more bacteria to come in, to break things down quicker. So a lot of times just like chopping things up like your food scraps, chop them up a little bit before you compost them. If you have lawnmowers, shred that stuff, just having a lopper and just like cutting things, big things up a little bit with these loppers or pruners, helps out. Like it doesn't have to get like super fine, but just, you don't want to throw a whole watermelon or giant branch in there. You want to chop up that branch into at least a couple pieces before you throw in there. Like having wood chippers and stuff helps out a lot. We do have a wood chipper at our tool share whenever that opens that up if people want to do that. And then regular office paper or junk mail on non-glossy paper is okay to compost? Yeah, regular generic paper is almost always soy ink. You can, if you want to be double check, you can talk to, who supplies you with your ink, and you can find out the specs on their website. But almost all like newspaper and generic stuff is soy ink. It's just fancier stuff because it's more expensive. The fancier inks are more toxic inks that you gotta be careful about. Can I mix in soil from the forest? Yeah, if you want to like kind of pre-inoculate. It's kind of against the law to do, to grab things. But if you want to, I kind of encourage if you want to just get a little cup full of soil from a forest, a healthy tree stand or something, and just mix that into your compost. That will inoculate your compost with some really beneficial bacteria and stuff. But you can also just put that directly into your garden too, and that will inoculate your garden. But be really careful. Just do that at your own risk, because if a park ranger sees you, you could get fined. And because you're not supposed to take anything from parks, national parks and public parks and stuff. So just be aware of that. Another question: garden scraps okay if possibly disease, fruits, veggies that have fallen that have that rot on them, or maybe leaves that have a pest. Yeah, you want to be a little bit careful with we'll talk about that more in a second. Like tomatoes and stuff. We'll definitely address that in a second. But materials to avoid, yeah, definitely like plants with diseases and pests. So if you have like sometimes it's hard to tell like a tomato disease, a lot of tomato diseases you want to be really careful about because they are soil borne, meaning they'll survive. If your compost isn't hot enough to kill it, they'll survive the compost and they'll, you're just mixing it around. So a big, indicator is if you have a tomato that dies in the summer, throw that away. But if you have a tomato that dies when it should, die, like in the fall, then you can go ahead and compost that. Or if you're pulling off everyone has like early blight. It's like when the bottom branches get yellow. If you pull those off, just throw those in the trash. Don't throw those in your compost unless you know that you're getting really hot compost. Because if you could keep your compost over 135 degrees for a couple weeks, it'll kill bacteria. But that's really hard to do in your backyard or so plants with lots of disease and pests, plants that have lots of seeds. Now again, like some, like you'll get some seeds and that's fine. But if you have weeds that are going to seeds, definitely, don't, throw those in the trash. Don't throw those in the compost bin. Meats, fats, greases, bones, dairy, pet waste, all those things that get putrid and smelly and attract rodents. Poison ivy, pesticides, herbicides, anything non-biodegradable, anything toxic, all that stuff, obviously just keep out. And then animal amendments, which normally is okay, like blood meal and fish fertilizer. But the problem with that stuff is it could be really smelly. Like whenever I use fish fertilizer, if I use a little bit too much, I have cats running around my garden looking for the rotting fish, so that stuff I don't know. I mean, if you just use it, sparingly. Be careful with that. You don't want to dump a whole bottle of fish fertilizer in there. And then there's things to use moderately that are okay, like oils. Like you don't want to throw a whole stir fry in there because oils will actually get a little bit putrid. But if you have a little bit left over, that's fine. Breads, grains, rice, they'll get kind of moldy and putrid if you use too much. But again, it's all right to use a little. Like you don't want to fill like citrus and pine needles. It's just too acidic. But definitely compost citrus and pine needles, but just don't do a whole bin full of citrus and pine needles. And then spent grains from brewery. So if you're a home brewer, like how you brew beers, you kind of boil like hops and barley and stuff to get like their aromas out, and then you ferment that, but you're left, all the grains like the barley that after you boil it, you have to throw that away. It's called spent grains. So a lot of people, we have a lot of microbreweries, and they'll try to approach you and be like, hey, can you take my spent grains? Always say no, because it looks brown, but it's actually a very high nitrogen source, and it will actually get really stinky if you don't handle it just right. But if you have a local brewery, if you want to just add a little bit of it, that's fine. You just want to really mix it up with carbon so it doesn't get smelly. And then these compost bags, I mean, they advertise them as they can break down, biodegrade, but and they do, but they take a while. So if you're using compost bags, you just want to rip them open and then drop the contents and then rip them up in little pieces. You don't want to throw the whole bag sealed into your bin because then because it will take at least a month to break down, and then when you have finished compost, you'll have these little pockets of anaerobic unfinished compost because of these bags. So just rip them apart. You can compost them. Or if you bokashi, we'll talk about bokashi. Bokashi breaks these things down really quickly if you want. But hey, and then again, like tomatoes are the biggest things that you want to worry about with wilts and diseases, but a lot of times they're hard to tell, mainly like if your tomato dies in the middle of summer, don't throw it in your compost bin, just throw it in your trash. Same with blights and things like that, just throw it in your trash. But if it dies in the fall, it's probably, healthy, so you can compost that. But like I say, if you want to compost iffy things, you can get one of these compost thermometers. You need a long thermometer. We'll talk about this in a second, but all the bacteria likes to hang out in the middle of your pile, so you have to get something long enough to get into the middle to get the right temperatures. So if you get like 135 degree temperatures for a while, because a compost will get up to like 150, 160 if you have a big enough pile, if you have at least a 3-foot tall pile. Anything smaller, then you're not going to get anywhere close to that. So so if you're like an expert, you know what you're doing, you can compost like diseases and weeds, as long as you know that you're burning them up. Also, you can solarize pulverize them, you know, throw things in a black trash bag, set it in the sun for a month, and that should do it. But you know, mainly if you're not like an expert, if you're a beginner, just throw away anything iffy. Don't deal with it till you get, you know, till you really know what you're doing. So we talked about the first two ingredients were nitrogen sources and carbon sources. So these are your two main, you know, bulk materials that you're mixing in your ingredients. And the next two are oxygen and water. And those kind of go side by side, depending on, like, you know, if you have too much water, then you don't have enough oxygen. But the bacteria that you want, the aerobic bacteria that is going to break down your compost and keep your fertility and not just poop it in your air, is aerobic, is oxygen-loving bacteria. So they can only survive in oxygen environments. So that's why people turn your compost a lot. Because sometimes if you just let a pile sit for a while, it'll get anaerobic. It'll, you know, and you have to like turn it with a pitchfork or flip it over. If you have a compost tumbler, you know, just use a crank. We'll talk about those in a second. And then there's different cool ways, like if you active and passive aeration, like this is guy Peter Moon from Oregon that designs these systems that have like blowers that actually blow air from the bottom, and you can make a great finished compost in like a month or two with this. You know, you can order his supplies. He'll ship you materials to build it, but it is a couple $1,000s. But if you have that money, you're going to have amazing compost. But you can also do passive aeration, and this is what we do. This is the best thing to do if you're building a compost bin, is get that compost off the ground and then give it drainage. So this is what compost bins that we use. We'll talk more about these bins in a second, but we get it off the ground, and then we have paper stones that are spaced out by cracks, by screws. That allows, so as it's a convection cycle, as like the heat, you know, builds up in the compost pile, it will actually pull oxygen from the bottom and actually aerate itself. Same, if you're doing big piles, you can do these pipes and stuff. You just don't want to do these, you know, these piles of pipes in the urban environment, because you'll see rats love to just hang out in these piles, in these pipes. But if you're doing on a farm, yeah, definitely go for that. And then, like I said, the last thing is water, and this really decides, you know, how much oxygen you have, because you want some water, because the bacteria need water to survive and move around. But too much water, and it pushes out the oxygen. If you ever smelled a stinky compost pile, a lot of times that happens after it rains really hard. So you want basically moist soil, like a wrung out sponge. Like you want it to be moist and not dripping. If it's dripping, if it's too wet, then like I said, it's going to get stinky. It's going to get anaerobic. If it's too dry, then it's just going to take forever to break down. But the best thing you could do, like I said, with these like our compost bins, is get it off the ground and give it drainage, and then you can water it all you want, and it's, compost will hold on to the water once and then release extra water. So you can never really, like, these are smell-proof bins. They only smell if the drainage gets clogged. But if there's no clogged on the drainage, they never really smell, because they always allow the extra water to drip out. But having, you know, compost in piles on the ground, a lot of times if you overwater, then you're going to create pools on the bottom, and you're going to have a smelly pile. I was given a plastic bin that has holes around the bottom. What is the best way to cover the bottom with sticks, or with the sticks? It's hard to remove the compost from the door at the bottom. I would have to look at that plastic bin. I'm not really sure, because there's so many different models. You definitely want some holes in these plastic bins, but they need to be like 1/8 of an inch or smaller, so things can't get in there. But if you want to send me a photo of that, you can email that, and I'll give you some tips on whatever bin you have. All right, so urban composting best practices. So we definitely, like I said, like we're living in a city that has more rats than people, so we want to be careful. Again, like your garden's not going to, you know, create rat situations, but if you already live in an area that has rats, and like alleyways and dumpsters and trash cans, or like, you know, like developments, like if they, you know, demolish a big building, you'll notice rats all over the neighborhood, because a lot of them are hanging out in the bottom of these big buildings, and then they have to like run out. So it's important to, like, you know, not, you know, create situations that not going to attract them over to your garden. These are really great systems for if you're not using food scraps. So if you're just composting your garden waste, and maybe you're mixing in you know, some grass and things, water in it, whatever, or you just don't want to think about too much. You just want to have systems, just a place to put all your garden waste. These are all great systems that you can make yourself. They're basically, the main thing, like I said, is you want to have at least a 3-foot square or 3 foot cube. You want to have a bin that's 3 foot wide, 3 foot high, and 3 foot long, because you want to have a pile that's at least 3 feet to properly compost. It's all right if you can't have that. If you have smaller tumblers and stuff like that, that's fine. It's just going to take a little bit longer, and it's not going to be like this high quality compost, but it's still perfectly fine. Yeah, using pallets, you just want to make sure with pallets, you want to make sure there should be little markings that either say HT for heat treated, or I think it's like BT for or something else. You want to make sure it says HT for heat treated. Anything else, and it's treated, for herbicide or pesticides and stuff. Yeah, you want to make sure it has some kind of drainage, like even if it's on the ground, just making sure that it has, some kind of drainage. It's not just going to, like, it's not like a concrete pad where it's just going to like fill up with water. And it's better to have some of these systems are really nice. Like this one's like cattle fencing. You just make a cattle fencing circle. You fill up, you layer different layers. You fill this up with garden waste, and when it's to the top, you just pick up that cattle fence. Sometimes you got like some of the roots will grow in. You got to cut the roots on the bottom, and you just pick that up, put it to the other side, and just let that pile sit for a couple months and let it break down, and then you start your new pile. That's great. A lot of times you need to have at least like 2 systems, because if you fill up one, then you got to wait forever for it to break down so you can start filling up again. So having like 2 piles is like ideal. You fill up one, and then as you're waiting for that to break down, you start filling up the other one. And this is like good, like people make straw bales, and then they cover the top with straw. This is great. Some people use this for food scraps, and it works good for like the first couple months, but as that straw starts breaking down, like critters will start smelling it. Like we had a couple farms that tried this out, and it was great for like 6 months, and then they started having bad rat issues. So if you do any of these systems, again, just avoid food scraps, which is fine. Like everyone doesn't need to be composting their food scraps, or if you want to and you don't want to deal with like situations, you just join one of our cooperatives, or take it, DPW drop-off center. So a couple questions are, lately I just put the scraps in the back way, CK yard, and then throw some leaves and logs on top. Critters probably like it. Does this kind of composting work? I don't really know what you mean, like back way. Maybe if you want to send me another photo, I could definitely tell you about it, a little bit more about that. Yeah, I might answer some of your questions like trench composting and stuff like that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So if you do want to do food scraps, do you want to compost food scraps? Some of the reasons why people compost food scraps is a great source of nitrogen. It's going to make really nice compost. It's going to save the environment by not sending your food scraps to the dump. So there's just a couple of things. It's hard to really buy a bin. We'll talk about tumblers in a second. There are some tumblers you can work, but they're not great. You mainly have to build your compost bins, and this is why we had a problem. For like a decade, I just tried all these different compost bins, and they just caused all kinds of rat situations and stuff. So we actually worked with this company. Unfortunately, they're not around anymore, but they're called Urban Farm Plans, and we developed this what we call Fort Knox. Is really amazing critter-proof and rat-proof and smell-proof compost bin. And so these bins are kind of big, you can get individual ones. Like this whole bin is about $1,000 in material, and so it's not like everyone's going to build one of these in their backyards. But I just kind of want to dissect some of the design features, and these are features that people can use if they want to build their own compost bin. Like I built my own compost bin out of pallets. It only costs $10, but I use the design features in this to build it. So the first thing to understand is there's multiple species of rats in DC. I think there's 2 of them, and some of them climb, some of them can burrow. I can't keep them all straight. So just know that there are 3 different ways that rats can get into your compost bin. They can tunnel underneath. So if you just have a pile, if you're completely rat proof, but you're sitting on the ground, there's a good chance they could just tunnel right in there to get there. They could squeeze through really small holes, up to like if you want to be rat proof, you need to have all holes be ½ inch, like hardware cloth. So if you're doing chicken wire, like they can like actually dislocate their shoulders and squeeze through like chicken wire really easy. And then they can climb. There's one species that can climb. So you need to have a top. You can have a completely rat-proof bin, but if you don't have some kind of something on the top that's rat-proof, they're just going to climb right over. So these are some of the things to kind of think about when you're designing your bins. Um, so if you are, like I said, and I don't want to overwhelm people. You don't have, and not, everyone's not going to build their own compost bin, but if you are and you're interested, now's a great time with when you're stuck at home. Here's just some design features that to think about. One is you want hardware cloth. So again, not chicken wire. I've seen rats literally take a running start and just run through chicken wire. But you want to cover your bin entirely in hardware cloth. This is rat proof. Rats cannot squeeze through this. They can't chew through this. So yeah, definitely you want to have hardware cloth completely covering it, because one of the reasons why you could just have a completely sealed up bin, but then you're not getting oxygen, and you could have some smelly piles. So you want to have, like, as much as possible, an open bin with like big open sides that allow oxygen to get in, but just cover those openness with hardware cloth. Or if you're doing like pallets, like what I do, I'll show you a picture of it. I made a pallet bin, and I just covered it completely with hardware cloth on around, just so they can't get in there. Even on the bottom, like we have these paver stones on the bottom. This is like my favorite design feature of this bin, is because if you just have a wood floor, it's going to rot. If you just have it on the ground, it could get a little smelly if you overwater. But if you get it off the ground and just have some kind of like stone bottom with drainage, this is like the coolest design, which is, it's hard to replicate, but you can get the design, the designs from Urban Farm Plans. I think they're selling them for like $20, but it'll tell you how to do this. But yeah, but even like we even have a layer of hardware cloth on the bottom just in case one of these paver stones breaks, or if a mouse tries to squeeze through these cracks. So but yeah, and just having lids too. I'll show you what the lids look like. But the big another part with this hardware cloth, if you're just stapling this hardware cloth, and on the edges, rats can get, kind of pop open these little staples and it can squeeze through. So that's why it's good to have. It's called fascia boards. This is really like a design feature that's supposed to make things look nice, but it actually works really well for critter proofing, because you can get these nice boards, and you can get anything like a 2x4, and just like on whatever like the hardware cloth edges, you want to get like a 2x4 or some piece of wood, and just screw that in on the edges, so that way it can't keep, rats can't just pop open the sides of the hardware cloth and squeeze through. So yeah. And then like odor, things, like I said, just getting the bin off the ground and giving it some kind of drainage is amazing. Like you'll not have unless your drainage clogs, you won't ever have a smelly compost pile. But it's a little hard. This is a little advanced carpentry, so not everyone's going to do this. Like my home compost bin, I'll show you. I didn't do this, but I put a layer of hardware cloth on the ground, and then I just make sure it doesn't get overwatered. But this is like a foolproof, compost bin. If you can replicate something like this, it doesn't have to be paver stones. It could be like wood. It could be metal. You just want to have some kind of drainage off the ground, and the compost will hold on to the water at once, and then release any extra water, so it never gets anaerobic. And we actually, when we're building these bins, we build a couple of these bins every year. If anyone wants to help us when we can start hanging out again. But you can see, like, we space out these bins, these paver stones with the screws, and that allows drainage to happen. And then having circulation on the sides, big open sides, lids and stuff. Lid is really nice, because if you just have an open pile and it gets rained on, if it's a heavy rain, it could kind of overwater things and get it smelly. But having a lid will control exactly how much water you can add, so that which is nice if you don't have drainage. I know some of our cooperatives actually, like, they'll drill little holes into the lid so they can get a little bit of rainwater, but not overwatering too. And then the last part talk about is these slats. These slats are amazing. Even if they don't look too obvious, but the thing is, if you have a compost bin and you have a door that opens, all that compost could fall out. It's kind of difficult. But with these slats, like, let's say I have a pile that's like half the size of this bin, that's like 2 feet tall, and I need to move it over. I could just pull the first top 4 slats out, and then start scooping it over to the next bin, which we'll talk about turning and mixing the compost in a second, and then I can slowly move the slats down as I'm working, which if it doesn't seem obvious now, when you're actually doing this compost, it's really nice. And slats are really easy. You just need to make a channel. So I get these, they're called balusters. There's 2x2 boards, and I just screw a couple of them in and just have a channel of where I can move my boards up and down. So like I said, like, you can buy compost box designs, you can, buy single bins, you can hire people to build them if you have the money, or you can, or like I said, like what I did, you just take some of these design features and then make your own compost bin, which I'll show you in a little bit in a second. Some of the important parts about these bins is, one, they lock, especially if you're in a public area, you want to lock your bin. Like all of our compost cooperatives have combination locks, and you have to take an hour training to join. And we've learned that the hard way. We didn't lock it at first, and like people throw the most disgusting things in compost, like a lot of pet waste, diapers, all kinds of things, just because they don't know, there's no other trash can, so they'll throw it in your compost bin. So lock your bins if you're in a public area, like a community garden or something like that. Um, oh, Carol, and the last question on the backyard is where I dump scraps and then cover with leaves, logs, or whatever. Do I have to be careful? Yeah, if you're just dumping them just in the open, as long as it's just like, if it's not food scraps or anything, that's fine. You could do things to kind of increase it. You can chop things up, you can water it. You may want to think about, we're going to talk about trench composting and stuff like that, but yeah, I mean, if you want to, if you don't have food scraps, you could just do it in a pile. It just takes a little while. Like I said, like, you may want to think about like chopping things up and watering it just to get, break it down faster. Because if it's a giant brush pile that's going to sit there for years, it may become a rodent hotel. All right, so here's a couple, so these are probably more practical for people's backyard, examples. So single bin methods. So because maybe you're not into carpentry, you're not ready to develop in this giant bin, or design one. Like, these are a couple really easier options to do. One of them, the biggest priority is, if you're deciding what option is decide, do you want to just have a place to get rid of your organic matter, or do you want to actually like make a lot of compost for your garden? Because these could be two different kind of systems. But single bin systems, they're really more good just like holding your garden waste and kind of slowly breaking them down. So I have a single bin system in my yard that I put most of my stuff in, but I belong to a cooperative, and that's where I get most of my really high quality compost is from that cooperative, because the systems, they just break down slowly. Like, this is my compost system down here. I'll talk about in a second, but I maybe I get one harvest a year out of this guy, as opposed to every month at cooperative I'm getting more and more compost. But I don't really care, like I just want a place to store yard waste, and break it down slowly. So it's really your preference. But if you're doing a tumbler, so tumblers are these plastic rat proof bins that usually are on some kind of stand, or sometimes they have ground stands, and you could turn, they flip over, you can turn them upside down. So those work, I mean, different variations. Like if you have a small tumbler, it's fine, you can keep on using it, but I would recommend trying to get the biggest tumbler as possible. Like this one I've used is really nice. It's an 80-gallon one, lifetime. Because the bigger it is, the more ability that you're going to have. The more ability you're going to have to actually compost things, a lot better. So because the more space, the more material you build up, the better it composts and the quicker it's going to compost. So sometimes, yeah, but it can take a while. Sometimes though, it's like when these get heavy, they're really hard to turn. They may fall over and stuff. It's a little bit tough. But again, you want to make sure, mix your carbon and all that stuff in there and water it, yeah, tumblers, I mean, if you're looking for an easy thing just to try out, yeah, tumblers are good. They're just a little tricky. I know Institute of Local Self-Reliance, ISLR, they've been contracted by DPW. It's the contract's on hold, but when the pandemic's over, hopefully they do a lot of classes around tumblers and stuff. And then like, metal trash cans. If it's a plastic one, rats can definitely chew through it, but if it's a metal one, just drill little holes like 1/8 of an inch or quarter of an inch. You could fill your compost up, and then maybe get some bungees, secure the lid, and you just roll it around in your yard. So I know people that do that. Um, So this is what I do, like a non-term brown bin. So this is kind of like the easiest way, to do composting, in my opinion. Is so I built this rat-proof bin where I basically just I put a bunch of pallets together. I layered the pallets with harbor cloth. I put some harbor cloth on the bottom so nothing's going to tunnel in. I have a lid. It's not even on hinges. It's just like a bunch of 2x4, scrap, and I put some harbor cloth. So very simple. It took me like a couple hours to build, like maybe like $10 in screws and hardware. But so I filled this bin completely full of garden waste, or just like carbon material, so dried out garden waste and leaves and stuff. And what I do is whenever I have extra food scraps, I'll just, every other day I'll come out here and just shove the food scraps in the middle of that carbon pile. And so I don't mix it up a lot. I'm not watering it a lot. I'm not doing a whole lot for it. I'm just like, I'm just making sure that there's no exposed food scraps, that it's all shoved in and covered in carbon. And things will slowly break down. Like I said, I probably harvest this. I get a harvest maybe once a year, and it's not even it's not that much. But at the same time, it's just like a generic thing that it keeps my yard waste in the pile, keeps it secure. I don't have to worry about rodents, and it's just an easy way for me to do it. So that, I mean, like I said, like if you're just like, this is like too much, I don't want to deal with this. This is a great system. You could build yourself. Some of the recommendations, though, when you're doing single bin systems, is just keep brown bin. So we're going to talk about brown bins, but idea is, like, a lot of times you don't want to run around looking for browns every time you're mixing your food scraps in a tumbler. You want to have like a trash can full of leaves, and then as you add to your tumbler, you can add leaves. And then there's a nice thing is get two of these too, because when you fill up this guy once, then you're gonna have to wait a couple months for it to break down. So if you have two tumblers, you fill it up once, and then you can start filling up the other one as the other one's breaking down. And also, don't forget to water if you want, your compost quicker than usual. Definitely, think about watering. All right, so we have a couple questions. It is food scraps that I dumped in my backyard and cover in leaves and logs. There's likely a woodchuck around, likes the eggshells because the neighbors likes the woodchuck as a friend and sees it eaten. Yeah, a long time ago, I had a similar compost bin where I was basically just like a half a barrel that was in my backyard, and I would just throw my food scraps in there, and it would all magically disappear later on. And I later found out that I was basically just feeding all the local rodents and the raccoons and stuff. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely not rat proof. You're definitely going to be feeding, critters. If you live out in the country, I mean, that's what people do out in the country. They just have giant piles, and it's not a big deal to feed them. That's fine. But if you're living in like urban areas and stuff, I probably wouldn't do that. Just an open pile. I would try to get some kind of system like this where I can, secure it a little bit better. All right, so 3 bin system. So if you're joining one of our cooperatives, or you're looking to like actually make a lot of compost, you're not just looking to store, brown waste, but you actually want to make a lot of compost. 3 bin systems are probably the best way to make compost, because you never have to stop, filling things up. How it works is basically you want to fill the first bin up, and so only fresh material ever goes into the first bin. And then because whenever you add fresh material, I'll show you a graph. There's a whole process that compost goes through with different levels of bacteria, and it's a very delicate process. And every time you throw a fresh food scraps in there, you're kind of hitting the reset button on the process. That's why a lot of times with these single bin systems, they just take forever to break down, because you're like constantly hitting the reset button every time you add stuff. But the idea is you want to fill this up with carbon and nitrogen. Ideally, like in a perfect situation, like in a month. But I mean, it's going to take a lot longer for other people. But then, when this is full, you turn it, which is getting a pitchfork, and you just flip it over to the second bin. You let that just kind of sit there and process, and then you start filling this up again. And then by the second month, this is full, so you flip bin 2 to bin 3, bin 1 to bin 2, and then you start filling this up again. And by the third month, once this is full, bin 3 should be almost done. It should be a lot of finished compost, but it'll still have things that take forever to break down, like avocado pits and corn cobs and stuff. But yeah, you'll have to sift out, and then you gotta let it sit and cure for a couple weeks, which basically means all the little bugs, like pill bugs, will eat anything left over, and then it's ready to go in your garden. But this is a nice, because like I say, if you have a lot of people and you want to produce a lot for like a community garden, this is like the way to go. So I'll talk a little bit about like actually like building a compost pile. So again, like I've taken a lot of compost classes and they trained us and build piles that look like this. This is great if I'm on the farm, but I do not want to build a pile like this in my backyard when I'm living in a city, because this is just like, I mean, there's gonna be rats everywhere. So you want to build your piles in critter-proof situations, whether that's like a tumbler or like your own little carbon bin, or like I'll show you how to actually build really, well, like cooking compost piles. So the first idea, if you really want to, if you're composting to build, to make a lot of compost, to put back in your garden, you want to try to, we're going to talk about some good practices. So the first part is you want to create a carbon biofilter. So the idea behind this is you want carbon material to completely cover all your food scraps. You never, this is like the best, I mean, a lot of this stuff, you're gonna, it's just not gonna sit in like a lot of things I'm talking about. You're gonna learn way more just like trying out compost and figuring out as you go. But the one thing that I want to stress that everyone should walk away from this presentation is you should never have exposed food scraps. So if you have exposed food scraps, you're going to have flies and stuff the first couple of days, and then you're going to have critters. Even if you're in a critter-proof bin, you're still going to attract critters to the garden. So this is like the one thing that the takeaway from this presentation is if you're composting, you should never actually see food scraps. It should just look like a giant pile of yard waste, and the food scraps should be in the middle. So how we do this, we create a carbon biofilter, which is completely encompassing the food scraps, the carbon material. So if there's any smells, if someone throws some chicken in there and it starts getting putrid or anything, it filters out any bad smells. So you're not going to attract, rodents, as long as you have a good, a couple inch thick layer of carbon. And how to start that out is if you're doing in one of our compost cooperatives, the first thing you always do is like scrape out the drainage cracks. You always want to keep that drainage crack going, because like again, the only time these bins smell is if the cracks get clogged. And then you want to make a nest of carbon material, of like wood chips and chunky stuff and cut up yard waste, and you make it 2 to 3 inches thick. You make that make it like an actual bird's nest, where the edges are a little bit taller, so when you because you're going to put your food scraps right in the middle, you don't want them like kind of pushing up and being exposed on the sides. So you start out making your biofilter layer. And then you do what's called lasagna composting. And so the reason why we do lasagna composting, instead of just mixing it all at once every time you add compost, is this is going to slow things down, and it's going to buy you some time to actually build up a decent sized pile before you mix it all up. And because bacteria really loves it when it's mixed. So that's, once you mix your pile, you're going to have, your temperature is going to shoot up. But if you mix it too early, like you mix it before you have a 3-foot pile, it's just not going to be as effective. So doing lasagna composting is going to slow things down and allow you to actually accumulate some size. And this is basically just making lasagnas out of browns and greens. So you start out with your brown layer, your nest, and then you add some greens in the middle, some food scraps, and then you cover that up with browns, and then add some more food scraps the next day, and then cover that up browns. The main thing is just you always cover it up with browns. And there's different ratios. Like industry standards is like 3 to 1. Like for every bucket of food scraps, you should have 3 buckets of browns. But industry standards are based on having all your material at once and having paid staff to mix it. So we're not industry standards. So what works a lot better is 2 to 1 for us. That means if I drop off a bucket of food scraps, I'm going to get 2 buckets of browns and cover that up. And some people will even go down to 1 to 1, but I recommend starting out with 2 to 1. Some reasons why you go down to 1 to 1 is if you're having trouble getting like decent temperatures and stuff. A 1 to 1 will allow more nitrogen and allows more bacteria and gets hotter temperatures. So basically how this looks is, I have my nest, and I'm going to drop in, a bucket full of food scraps right in the middle. I'm going to spread it out so it's no more than like 2 or 3 inches layer. And then I'm going to completely cover up all those food scraps with carbon material. so that way, again, like you can't see any food scraps anymore. It's going to be a nice solid 2 to 3 inch layer. If it's like a really sparse layer, you may still get flies and stuff going in. Like if you ever open up a compost bin, there's fruit flies everywhere. That's because maybe either your food scraps are exposed or it's not like a solid layer. But you want to have a nice solid layer of carbon material, and you just want to repeat this. Then maybe the next day or two, or once a week, you drop off another bucket in the middle, and then just keep on adding that, and you just keep on doing that till you build up. A lot of times, with these smaller systems, or if you're just by yourself, it's going to break down faster than you build up. I mean, it takes like a good 20, 30 people in our cooperatives to actually build up a nice sized pile. And a lot of times we'll even work with compost cab to get some more injections of compost, and stuff. But yeah, so that's, you want to kind of slowly fill this up. And like I said, the biggest thing takeaway is never have exposed food scraps. That's going to be, it's going to get smelly. It's going to attract animals. It's going to have, insects. No one should ever see that you're actually composting food scraps. And so you keep on filling up till you get to the top like this. And once you get at least a 3-foot pile, that's when it's time to kind of move it to the next bin and mix it all up. And that's when the bacteria is going to go nuts, and you're going to have great temperatures and stuff like that. So one of the reasons, so another thing, if you're doing these systems and you're trying to make a lot of compost really quickly, you need to have a brown storage bin, a carbon storage bin. Basically a bin, it could be a trash can, it could be whatever. It could even be a pile of just brown material. And that way, every time you drop food scraps off, you don't have to run around the park looking for carbon material. You could just scoop up your browns and then cover it up. But again, this is one of those things where if you don't have any carbon, just throw away your food scraps. You don't want to drop you don't want to compost your food scraps if you can't completely cover it with carbon material. Critters don't usually care so much about carbon piles, but over the winter sometimes, if we have a giant pile of carbon on the ground, they might overwinter. So that's why we actually make these hardwood cloth bins where we just make circles out hardwood cloth and have a top sometimes, and just throw over, have a bottom. That's just, mainly for winter, just so rodents don't hang out in the winter. But during the summer, it's not that big of a deal, especially if you have an active compost and you're actually using that pile and just not letting it sit for years. And a lot of times, we'll talk more about sifting things, but when after about 3 months, you sift a lot of corn cobs and stuff, and at that point, rodents they don't care about that stuff. So so it doesn't need to be rodent proof. So then you can take those avocado pits and corn cobs, and then you can actually put them in your brown pile, and that will actually pre-inoculate your browns, because you really want to kind of have a mulchy, kind of half broken down browns. That's what makes really great compost. So again, you want to have chunky, multiple, shredded paper, straw, whatever, and even after you start sifting things, you can start throwing leftover stuff just to pre-inoculate. All right, and then turning your compost. So a lot of times how compost works is all the, well, once you build that lasagna composting, I mean, you'll get some temperatures. It may get 100 degrees or so, but you're not going to really attract your bacteria until you mix it up and turn it and water it, and then that's when bacteria love that stuff, and they really start coming. And so ideally once a month. I mean, you can turn your compost every day, and if you turn your compost every day, you're probably going to have a nice finished compost in the month. But it's just a lot of work, and a lot of times when you turn your compost, a lot of greenhouse gases will will escape. So that's why a lot of times we don't like to turn it more than we have to, and we don't want to burn people out. So in our compost cooperatives, we recommend that they turn their compost once a month. That's a general good time if you're trying to produce a finished compost. But again, if you're just trying to store stuff and you don't care about finished compost, I mean, I don't turn my compost at home at all. So that's just something to think about. But yeah, turning is just a fancy word for getting a pitchfork. Pitchforks work a lot better than shovels, but you only got a shovel, you gotta do what you gotta do. But and you just move it up and you just flip it over to the next bin. So whenever your first bin's ready, you flip it to the second bin, fill that first bin back up, and flip bin 2, bin 3, bin 1 to bin 2, and just so forth. And then like I said, if you really want to get crazy on composting and make a really awesome compost really quickly, so we worked a lot with Eco City Farms. This is what they do. They built a couple of these 3 bin systems, but they like to turn their compost like, once a week, if more, because they want to make, a lot of finished compost really quickly so they can get that back into their farm. This is a urban farm out in Hyattsville. So they built these troughs, which is this plywood on the bottom and then just like a 2x4. And then they pull all the carbon, all their compost out once a week. They mix it all up in this trough, they water it, and then they throw it back into that bin. And then that way they just get really, really awesome, really nice compost. But it's a lot of work, and it's really up to you, like how much labor you want to put into it. But if you do that, wash it. I'll get some Dr. Bronner's and just wash what's left over, just so you don't have like food smells left out where critters are going to come. All right, so we have a question. Please explain how to pre-inoculate browse bins. Well, I'll explain that in a second when I talk about sifting. I think that might be the next, or in 2 slides. So the next thing to understand is watering. You need to keep these piles moist. And if they're open piles and it's raining, I mean, that's fine. But if it's like something like has drainage, drainage is great because it stops, anything from smelling, but it can dry out a lot quicker with drainage. So you ideally, like when a compost bins, it's a good idea if you're trying to create really good finished compost. You want to water your compost once a week. It could be like 5 or 10 gallons bins. I actually looked up this about 30 seconds of your hose. Your hose waters 17 gallons per minute. So you really only need about 5 or 10 gallons for a 3-foot pile. So you want to make sure water your compost bins, especially ones that you turn and you're not adding any new material to. You want to make sure water them once a month or once a week. Our compost cooperatives usually only water these. They only water once a month during their monthly work days, and that's fine too. But if you want to increase, their speed, it's all about how quickly you want to make finished compost. The more you water, the more that you'll have a better, quicker compost. So how compost process, works, like I said, like there's a process it goes through, and there's different levels of compost. So a lot of times, every time you add new material, it kind of hits a reset button. It's got to start all over. But how once you have a pile, and once you've turned it and watered it, all of a sudden you're going to track all this bacteria, if you have a 3-foot pile, it's going to get up to 140, 160 degrees, up in this area. There's different levels. Like there's a mesophilic bacteria that come at first, but then once you get into like 110 degrees, there's a different thermophilic bacteria that comes and gets it even hotter. And that's where really great composting happens, and it's thermophilic. You want to try to be up in this area as much as possible because they are just amazing compost bacteria. And that's what's going to break down diseases and seeds and things like that. But that they all hang out in the middle of your pile. They don't hang out on the edges for some reason. So they'll eat up all your bacteria, all your nitrogen in your middle of your pile. And after like a couple of weeks, they run out of bacteria or run out of nitrogen, so they go away. So then you'll start seeing the temperatures go down. And then you're like, well, so that's a good indicator. It's time to turn your compost, to mix it up again, because you still have nitrogen, but it's just not located in the middle. It's on the outside. So you mix up your compost again, get that nitrogen back into the middle. The bacteria comes back and then it shoots up again, and then they hang out for a little while, and then they'll start dropping down again, and then you turn it again. And the idea is you do this like for 3 or 4 months. You keep on turning it, and then eventually the temperatures won't go up again. Eventually it'll just be room temperature, and that means that all your nitrogen has been broken down by bacteria, and there's nothing left for them to eat, so they're moving on. And at that point, you would want to go ahead and sift it, so you want to, so at the point when you have room temperature compost and you're not getting any more temperatures, that's when you want to start sifting it. You can, make these little sifters out of 2x4s with some hardware cloth over a bucket. You just have one person kind of scoop, and then a couple other people kind of with their hands kind of like panning for gold, kind of sifting it. And then like it'll be covered in pill bugs. If you have a fear of pill bugs, don't be a part of this process. There'll be thousands of pill bugs, these little really pulley bugs, and they're great. They break things down even more. So what I do is I sift it out. I'm left with some chunky stuff, like corn cobs, wood chips. Wood chips, they need they have lignin that makes it hard, and it only breaks down with funguses. So it takes a couple rounds because these composts are more bacterial processes. So you'll sift out all that stuff. And then that stuff that you sift out, that's what you can use to pre-inoculate your browns bin. You could throw that, a lot of people will throw them back in the first bin, but then it just accumulates and gets too brown heavy. So I'll throw this back into my browns bin, because at that point, like, a rat doesn't want a corn cob that's been sitting in the compost bin for 3 months. So at that point, it's just, you throw that in your browns bin, and that like pre-inoculate your browns, and it'll start breaking things down. And that's really the brown, you want like a mulchy, kind of half broken down brown. That's like the really good browns that makes really good compost. And then the stuff you sift out, you can let it sit in a pile. Some people cover it. You don't have to. It's not going to wash away, or at least it's going to take a lot of rain to wash away. But I let it sit for like a week or two. It's called curing, and I mainly just wait for the bugs to go away. Once all the bugs are gone, all the roly-polies, then I know it's ready to go back into my garden. And that point, you can put it back into your, you can mix it into your garden. So if you have a great system that's working really well, and you have enough people dropping stuff off, this whole process will take about 3.5 months. But every month you're producing like a finished compost. But that's if you're like working in this like 3 bin with lots of community members. If you're just doing this in your home, it's going to take a lot longer, and it's going to, yeah. All right, and then finishing compost. So a couple tips, like this could be that hand sifting takes forever. It could be like 4 or 5 hours of hand sifting. So we've been building these like tumblers, these sifting tumblers, and this will it takes me a half an hour now to finish, to sift out this bin. It's really fantastic, and we're actually going to have a class this summer on how to actually build these things. Because if you're producing a lot of compost, you definitely want a tumbler sifter. But And then, and sometimes it's good if you have like, a lot of that, the runoffs, if you have drainage and a lot of that water runoff from compost is called leachate. Some people try to, claim it's compost tea. It's not compost tea. Compost tea is made out of finished compost. This is just like runoff from your compost. It could be beneficial. It could be, too high in nitrogen. It could have, pathogens. So a good idea, like a lot of our bins, we'll plant these buffer zones where we'll mix the soil with some sand, and then plant like plants like comfrey and stuff that will just they'll absorb that leachate, and then you can rip up, like comfrey. You can actually, harvest comfrey and then throw that into your compost bin, and that will add even more nutrients and stuff. So and then storing your compost at home. So if you just store your compost in the bucket, it's going to get nasty really quickly, your food scraps. So you want to get these carbon filters that allow some oxygen to get in, so it keeps it aerobic, so it doesn't get anaerobic and putrid. But it's still going to, these are only going to buy you about a week. So you need to have like some kind of like pattern where you're dropping off these compost bins once a week. If you want longer than that, store them in your freezer if you have room. The idea is that you just freeze them into these blocks, and then you drop off that frozen block and throw a bunch of carbon on top, and it will melt out, and it will settle into a lasagna compost eventually. So you could just drop off frozen blocks of food scraps right in there. Just cover it really well with carbon. How long does freezer get you roughly? Oh, you can store your food scraps in a freezer for years. I mean, as long as you want. I mean, it's not going to rot or get putrid. It's just like, how long do you want to have a bunch of food scraps in your freezer? So it's yeah. And then, so some shooting guides, troubleshooting guides. So if you smell, like rotten egg smells or poop smells, like ammonia smells, chances are it's like too moist or it's getting anaerobic. So if that happens, you just want to add some, carbon. You throw a bunch of carbon on top, and then just get a pitchfork and just kind of mix everything up. Maybe check your drainage and making sure the drainage isn't clogged. If you have drainage, maybe like air it out for a little bit. Don't water, stop watering. And like I said, after a day or so, it'll go back to normal. The good bacteria will come back. If you have if you open your bin, there's flies everywhere. You need to you probably have some exposed food scraps, so you need to walk around your pile. And a lot of times it's like on the bottom. It's it's an apple core that's being pushed against the side. And you just want to do a quick look around and make sure you cover everything up with carbon. And if it's just taking forever to break down, you may need to water it more. You may need to get more air to it. Maybe get off the ground with some drainage, those bins, or add more nitrogen, like go from a 1-to-1 ratio. Or a lot of times, a lot of our compost cooperatives, they work with Compost Cab, which is like this paid compost service where you pay them things like $30 or something like that a month, and they'll come pick up your food scraps. And they bring a lot of all that food scraps to our compost cooperatives, and we train their staff where they come in and they'll just they'll load up, like they'll drop off a big injection of food scraps. And what that does is it kind of jump starts your compost. Because a lot of times, again, like if you only have a couple people dropping off, you're just never accumulating enough material, to really get those like awesome temperatures and that thermophilic bacteria. So if you mix in like a big load of food scraps and you load it properly, like still do lasagna compost, mix in carbon, then it's a nice injection and it just gets your whole compost pile going and you get some really great temperatures and stuff. All right, we're going to talk about Bokashi in a second. Bokashi is fantastic. Yeah. Equipment. Having a compost thermometer is great, but don't leave these out over the winter. They'll freeze and they'll break. Having this like this is called a compost probe. This works really well with like if you have a single bin and like maybe it gets smelly and you just want to mix it up. You just like you stab it in there and these little wings come out, and as you pull it out, it kind of mixes things up a little bit. And then like definitely recommend like pitchforks or manure forks. It's just hard to make turn compost with shovels. Forks work a lot better. And then we talked about this in the last class, so I won't spend too much time on this, but if you do have a rat situation, it's really not a big deal if you're in your backyard, because you could just like grab your tumbler or whatever you're doing and just throw it all in the trash, it's and just like but like this is more like if it's at a community garden or something like that with a big system, this is like it's a really serious matter. Again, like we went over this in the last class, but look, you want to make sure if you have holes, check rat holes are between 2 to 4 inches. If it's like smaller, it's like moles or ground insects you don't have to worry about, or bigger, it's a groundhog, which is a whole nother situation. But a lot of times, like I said, rats aren't attracted because you're growing tomatoes. They're not going to be like, oh, this person's growing tomatoes, I'm going to leave this dumpster full of like rotted food and then go in there. They're attracted because you have a because you have a smelly anaerobic compost bin, or you have a giant dumpster right next to your garden, and then it may come for the compost or the dumpster, but they might stick around and eat your sweet potatoes and things like that. So remove any kind of bad compost situations, falling, rotting fruit. If you have fruit trees and the fruit's rotting on the ground, things like that. You want to just keep that sanitized. And then if you do have these holes, you want to treat them really quickly. The easiest solution is just call a exterminator. They'll work with you on whatever solution that you want. But if you know anyone that's got these like dogs, there's a lot of dogs that are bred for rat catching, and they're amazing rat catchers. Terriers and pinchers and schnauzers and stuff. They will take care of your rats really. There's actually people that will you can rent out these dogs. They're really expensive. But I really think the best thing to do is just get some dry ice from a liquor store and just shove it down all the holes you see, and then cover the holes. It's like carbon monoxide poisoning. It's actually a lot more. There's no humane killing, but it's a lot better than like poisons. It's pretty, and then they'll just go to sleep and then they won't come back, but and then just do that once a week. And if you see some new holes, buy some more dry ice, shove it down in there and cover the hole, and you just repeat that. And usually after the first or second week, you've gotten all the rats. But again, not to scare you, I just think it's important to talk about this stuff in case it happens. Like I said, if you're like, I don't want to do this, just don't, compost food scraps, or take your food scraps to a compost cooperative, or do rat bins or worm bins, or all the other solutions we're about to talk about. So this is just if you do food scraps, just something to think about. And then, like I said, we have these cooperatives around the city. So if it's just too much for you, like I said, I don't want to scare people. I just want people to be intentional. But if you're like, I'm not ready for this, just join one of our cooperatives. They aren't taking any new members right now because of the pandemic. We have social distance, so they can't have work days. But as soon as this is over, they'll start taking new members. You take an hour training, and then you can drop off all the food scraps you want at a critter-proof and compost bin, and then you get to actually process it with your community members. It's fun. It's a great way to meet people, and it's a great way to really understand compost. So if you're new to it, I would recommend recommend maybe joining one of these cooperatives, getting some experience, and then maybe building your bin at home, or something like that. And we were contracting this company called Loop Closing. It's really cool. They're developing this Google Suits app that you can pull up on your phone, and it tracks how much material people are dropping off. People can weigh it and drop it off, and then we can actually have, like, you could see your stats, like how much how many pounds of food scraps you've composted over the year. You can actually have competitions, who's like the leading composter in your site, or which site is like composting. And ideally, like, we were going to launch this summer and have prizes and stuff, but this is probably going to be put on hold till the pandemic. But it's really cool. I'm really excited about this. All right, so now we're going to talk about different alternative composting systems, and it is 12:45. We'll probably go like another 10 minutes or so over, just to give you a heads up. But we'll record this if you have to leave at 1. But Bokashi is super cool. So Bokashi is the only time you can really compost in anaerobic environments, because you're basically fermenting your compost. And how this works is they have these solutions. You can make your own solutions too, from like rice waters and stuff. But it's just this anaerobic bacterial solution, and you inoculate bran, like it could be wheat bran or rice husks or something like that, or spent grains from breweries, and you can inoculate them. It's the whole process. It takes like a couple weeks to inoculate the stuff. There's YouTube videos on how to do that, or you can just buy your inoculant, your brand pre-inoculated. It's kind of pricey, but then, like, idea is you have a sealed bucket. You can have these nice buckets that you can drain liquids, or you just have a regular 5-gallon bucket. And you don't, what's cool about this is you don't need carbon. You don't need any brown material. It's all food scraps. And you just throw a layer of food scraps in the bottom, and then you sprinkle this bran on top. And then you take like a plastic bag or something and just push it all down and you're making like this anaerobic squished environment. And then every day you add a little bit more food scraps. You pull the plastic bag out. You add a little bit more food scraps, a little bit of inoculant, and then push it down. And you do this, over a couple of weeks until your barrel, your container is completely full. And once it's completely full, then you just seal it, and then you let it sit for a couple of weeks. And what it does is it's going to ferment everything. And it's going to halfway break things down. It's not going to completely compost things, but it's going to break things down to the point that and ferment it that rodents don't want it anymore. And then after that, you could do a bunch of things with it. You can either feed it to your worms. Worms love it's halfway broken down fermented food scraps. Or you can throw it into your compost bin, and it's just going to be an injection of foods of food scraps, but it's going to help, it's like pre-inoculated, so it's really you're going to have some happy compost. Or what a lot of people do is they just bury it directly into their garden, like into an area that they're not going to plant for a couple weeks, and the soil biology would break it all down within a couple weeks, and then you got this amazing soil afterwards. So it's a really cool thing. The only problem is, like, you can do this indoors, but if you do it outdoors, this bacteria is a window. It's only active between like 60 and 80 degrees or something. So if it gets too hot or too cold, it's hard to do. But a lot of people will do this, like they'll keep their bucket underneath their kitchen sink. And it's really cool. Black soldier fly larva. So this is so if you ever had a bunch of maggots in your compost bin, well, I mean, unless you're throwing a bunch of meat into it, which it could be actual meat and maggots from your meat. And chances are it's not maggots. It's actually a black soldier fly larva. And these guys are actually like the fastest composting insect out there. They just they'll destroy your food scraps. And it's really great. They'll make like it's not quite a vermicompost, but they'll make like a more of a wet compost. And they'll break things down, and then when they're done, after a couple of weeks, they'll try to climb somewhere, and they'll try to pupate. And that's where a lot of people they'll intentionally. These guys are attracted because you have exposed food scraps, and a certain type of fly landed and lays eggs. So if you want to get rid of them, just cover everything up with carbon, and they'll all pupate and leave. And but I mean, they came because you have exposed food scraps. But some people actually who like these and they use them for chicken feed, they'll actually attract these guys. They'll have a bucket like this with like PVC pipes that lead upward to another bucket, and they'll attract their critters they'll attract the flies with some exposed food scraps, and they'll lay all their larvae, and after a couple of weeks of eating, these larvae will crawl up looking for some place to pupate, and they'll drop in this bucket, and they can either feed them directly to chicken, they can dehydrate them, freeze them. And there's like this ratio for like feeding things like chickens and fish on the aquaponics, systems of like, how much an animal can absorb versus how much it poops out. And this is like the highest ratio of, I mean, it's like almost 100% the animal absorbs almost everything. And so it's really great chicken feed and animal feed. I actually know, I used to belong to this aquaponic club a long time ago. And this guy, he made a hot tub into this aquaponic thing system. Aquaponics is where you have like fish that poop out. You use their fish poop to, and then you kind of break it down a little bit, and then into a more plant accessible, and then you feed these plants with this fish poop water, and then that breaks it down, filters it, and then it returns clean water to your fish. So it's like this closed loop cycle. And so you had a bunch of fish in the middle, like goldfish and stuff, and then you had these like containers around the edges with full of plants, and it was just this circle. But well, he claimed what he would do, if when he would go on vacation, he would like make one of these systems, throw a bunch of food scraps, get some flies, and make larvae like a week or two before he went on vacation, and then to set it up so when they were like full, they would climb up and then they would fall into the hot tub and the fish would eat it. And that was like his system to like feed this fish as he went away. I don't know how good it was, but yeah, definitely black soldier fly. Don't freak out. Like I said, just cover it. If you see this, just recover them with carbon. They'll help break things down faster, and they'll leave, as long as there's no exposed food scraps. Trench composting is another great source. If you have an area that you want to turn into a garden, maybe like a month or two, ideally a couple months if possible. You dig a trench or dig a hole, throw a bunch of food scraps, and then cover it with soil. And ideally, you want to cover it with 6 to 8 inches. Anything that's like, if it's just a shallow covering, you can have raccoons and stuff dig it up. But you want to have a good 6 inches of soil on top. And you don't really have to do anything. And you can water it if you want, but you just come back a couple months later, and the biology in the soil is going to break all the stuff down, and you're going to have this amazing soil to plant a garden. So it's a really cool process. And then you could do something similar like this with compost towers, where you get like a PVC pipe or something similar that's got perforated on the bottom. You can puncture some holes, and you just shove that into your garden, and then get some night crawlers. So there's a difference between night crawlers and red wigglers. We'll talk about red wigglers. Those are composting worms. They can't live in the soil. They live on the brush, so they love compost bins. But night crawlers can actually crawl into your soil. So you go to the local, any store that sells bait, for fishing bait, buy some night crawlers, throw them in there. You might already have them in your soil, so you may not even need to buy them. And then you throw some food scraps into there. And like with these night crawlers, they don't actually eat your food scraps. What they do is they come in here and they grab a bite of food scraps, and then they tunnel around your garden, and they spread out your food scraps, and they let different funguses and bacteria build on these food scraps, and then they come back and eat those the bacteria and funguses. But what they're doing is they're like tilling your garden for you. They're spreading all kinds of organic matter around your garden. It's just making your garden super healthy. So this is a great way, if you want to just, you can't overfeed this. So it's just a handful of food scraps, maybe every day or two. But then you'll have your worms kind of spread that around and just like slowly feed your garden. It's a really cool system. So the question, food scraps are good for wiggly worms. How much food scraps and what kind of scraps? Yeah, we'll talk about vermicompost in a second for sure. Yeah, you got to be intentional with what you feed red wigglers. So I think the last thing we're going to talk about before we go into vermicompost is the keyhole gardens. So keyhole gardens is kind of a permaculture kind of thing. The idea, it's very similar to that compost tower where you build these beds, these raised beds, and then in the middle you have these hardware cloth, rat-proof cylinders, and you drop food scraps down there, cover it up with maybe some carbon, and then all your biology will come in, eat those food scraps, pull it out, and then just fertilize the area. So there's some really cool keyhole gardens people have done. Really cool, but yeah, you gotta have a lot of time on your hands for that. All right, so the best compost we're going to talk about vermicompost, and I think this is a good. If you're a little bit overwhelmed, this is a good one to start out with. Vermicompost, they're kind of they become your pets, and they're a little tricky, but yeah, I think this is a good way to start out. It's a slow composting, so you can take your time. And they just make the best compost out there, like, because they have this awesome probiotic bacteria in their gut, and that gets, when they eat stuff and poop it out, you get that probacteria, and it's just like, it's the healthiest compost you can add. It's just, that's why when you try, people, some places will sell vermicompost, and it's so expensive because it does take a long time to break down, and you have to be, the disadvantage is that you have to be on top of you have to kind of monitor it, like, at least once a week. You can't compost everything, like, things that are like really pungent, like onions and garlic. They hate. Um, you don't need carbon. That's a good source. You don't need a whole lot. You need some shredded paper, but not a whole lot of carbon. And it just takes a while. But they do, multiply every couple months. They'll increase. They'll double their numbers. So if you have a compost bin, after a year or two, you're gonna have a lot of worms. And that's a lot of times. If you go on Craigslist, people are giving away worms just because they've had these old compost bins, and they just keep, as long as you're keeping it healthy, you really increase your worm population. But so if you're making a bin, essentially, easiest bin that people do is they get these totes. You can get any size tote. You can get a small one. You can get a big one. You want to get 2 totes and 1 lid. So the bottom tote, you don't drill holes in, you don't do anything. That's just to catch, like, the leachate, because there'll be a lot of liquids coming out of this compost, from your food scraps, and you want to capture that so you can drain it at, like, once a week so it doesn't get smelly. And the top one, this is where you want to drill a bunch of holes around the top of it. These are going to be breathing holes, so worms can get enough oxygen. And you want to drill them 1/8 of an inch or less. Yeah, 1/8 of an inch drill bits, because anything bigger than the worms could actually escape. And if they're happy in there, they're not going to want to escape. But if you, like, mess up, they're going to try to get out. So it's important that they can't get out. Um, and then the idea is, like, yeah, you want to start out, when you're starting a new bin, this is for the top bin. Again, the bottom bin, you don't do anything. It's just like a leachate catcher. But the top bin, you drill a bunch of holes on the bottom too of the top bin so it can actually leach to the bottom one. But then to start out, you want to get a bunch of shredded paper. You can do coconut coir and things like that. But you throw that in there. Get a spray bottle. Get it moist. You don't want it dripping, just moist. Then you want to get like a handful of soil from your garden, because they're like chickens. They have gizzards, and they need to prime their gizzards. It's like their teeth. It's what they use to chew things, and that soil will help prime it. So you throw a little cup of soil in there, and then you order your worms. Again, you can't just throw night crawlers. Night crawlers are not going to be happy. They need to live in the soil. These red wigglers, they live in the forest floors, so they don't actually go in the soil. They live in all the leaves and stuff. It's called duff. And so they love non-soil environments like this. So you can order them from, like, Uncle Jim's Worm Farm or Veterans Compost. It's a local compost place. They sometimes have worms, but Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, I think it's in Pennsylvania or someplace. They always have worms, and they have, like, lots of great deals. But you need to get at least 1,000 worms. It usually be like 1,000, 3,000, 5,000. There's different pricing. But they'll come in a little bag full of, like, looking like this. You throw them in the middle. And then, so this is an example. Yeah, you want to drill holes. These are way too big holes. These are bad examples. You want to have 1/8 inch holes, but you want to drill on the bottom and around the sides. Don't drill on the top, because they don't like sunlight. You want the top to be completely full on the lid. And like I was saying, you make the nesting, shredded paper, moist that paper up, add worms. And then once you add the worms, you can start adding some food scraps. Again, you want to avoid, citrus things, onions, things that are really pungent. Just want to add, like, they love banana peels, melons, things like apple cores, things like that. So you want to don't add too much. Just add a thin little layer on top. And then you want to kind of monitor it, because you want to kind of know how often you want to add it, because you don't want to just keep on adding food scraps every day. You want to wait until they're almost done with your first add, and then you add some more food scraps. Because if you add too much food scraps, it can get kind of moldy. You may get some fruit flies and stuff. So you want to kind of monitor it and try to figure out a good once a week kind of feeding. And then what helps a lot is once I add the food scraps, I'll add another layer of shredded paper. So I'll have a bucket of just shredded paper I keep right next to my bin, and I'll add the layer. That just helps if you have any fruit flies or anything like that. That'll keep that from happening. So again, like I cover up all my food scraps so you can't see food scraps in there with a layer of carbon. But then I got, to monitor it, I got to kind of move that aside to kind of see how quickly they're eating. And as they increase their population, they'll eat more and more. So it's like you're slowly kind of building this system up over time. But then like harvesting, so the idea is like after a while, they start pooping out this like great this great vermicompost, but they'll keep on working their way up. So the bottom is where all the great compost is, but they're working their way up. Every time you add more, food scraps, they're making a new layer of compost, and they're slowly, filling this up. So once one of these bins are completely full, you got to harvest them. But it's like, how do you harvest them without actually harvesting the worms and their eggs and stuff? So there's two good methods to do. One is once you're ready to harvest, you throw all your food scraps on one side for like a month, and then all the worms will move over to that side and start eating, and then their eggs will hatch. And this is what a red wiggler egg looks like, and they'll hatch and move over. And after about a month, or a couple weeks, like there's no more worms in here. You can check it out, and then you just scoop all that out. It's the most amazing compost ever. And then you put some more nesting in here, some more food scraps and all that, and they'll come back to the other side. And then after about a couple weeks, you can harvest the other side. So that's one method. Another method is just get a whole nother tote with a lid, poke some more holes on the bottom and the sides. Put that on top of your bin that's already full of compost, and then put another layer of nesting and food scraps, and they'll migrate up to the new bin to eat the new food scraps. And after about a month or so, or maybe a couple weeks, all the worms will be up in the top, and you just lift that up, put it into another drainage, and you have this whole tub full of amazing compost that you can do whatever you want with. So it is 1 o'clock, but I'm probably gonna just have about another 5 minutes or so if you want to stick around, but no worries if you got to go. Vermicompost, just to store your worms. They like between 50 to 85 degrees. So like under a kitchen sink is great. I know people make, coffee tables, they'll put like a piece of plywood on top as a coffee table. But a lot of people have roommates that don't like worms inside the house, so you got to keep them outdoors. So if you do keep them outdoors, keep them in a shaded area. You don't want them to get too hot in the sun. They don't like the sun at all. And then over the winter, if possible, bring them inside to like a basement or something like that. But if not, you can like dig a hole, throw them in there, and then cover the top with some mulch, and that will kind of protect them a little bit. A lot of times, if you got to keep them out in the winter, a lot of them will die over the winter, but usually a small amount of them will survive, and then they'll repopulate it. So it's a little tricky if you can't bring them inside. You kind of fluctuate the populations, and you have to kind of rebuild them. But if you can bring them inside, that's when you can, or give them some kind of like warm area outside, like in a hoop house or something like that. That's when you can really start building up your population. And troubleshooting, if you have if you open your bin, there's flies everywhere. That's maybe because the food's been sitting too long, and it just gave a chance for the flies to escape. So cover the food scraps with another layer of nesting, and then these like little apple cider vinegar traps, or you put some juice in the bottom with a funnel. The flies will go in there and they can't get out. So set a couple of these up. And you can even get like that sticky fly paper and put it on the lid, and that will help out. If you ever open your bin and it looks like this, you have failed as a worm parent. This only happens if it's just a bad situation. Mainly if there's no drainage and it's just like too wet down there, or you're not emptying the bottom drain dish as much as possible, and it's starting to flood areas. Or if you throw too many onion peels and stuff in there. Or they just like forget about them and you forget to feed them and they run out of food. They're going to try to get out. Ideally, if you built a good bin where all the holes are only 1/8 inch hole, they're not going to get out. But that's still a fail. So if you do that, you need to check the drainage. Add some more nesting. It's probably because it's too moist in there. It is usually what causes this. And then odor. If you do have any kind of odors, just get more nesting and cover your food scraps with nesting. That's going to prevent any odors. And then they make these nice worm hotels that you can actually catch the leachate. Some people love the leachate on worms. It's not quite compost tea, but it's still very more probiotic than compost leachate. At the very least, you can throw it into your garden, and it'll be some great probiotic. But I don't know a whole lot about worm leachate, but I know people do use it as sprays and things like that. So you can research that. Some people will make in-ground worm bins in their gardens where they'll have like latches and stuff, and dig a hole, cover it with so I've heard people have mixed success with this. You got to make it, they use cinder blocks because they want to keep critters from like like a raccoon or something will dig in there and eat all your worms. So you want to just keep it somewhat critter proof. Then compost tea. This is the last thing we're going to talk about before some safety tips. But this is basically when you want to make a great probiotic spray, where you get some finished compost, put in like a pantyhose or some kind of cheesecloth or something. Let it sit in a bucket of water. Get like a $10 aquarium pump from a pet store. Let it bubble, and then add some molasses, organic molasses, and then do that for like a day or two. And you're going to have this awesome, very all the beneficial bacteria is just going to blow up into your water, and you're going to have this probiotic spray. And then the spray you can spray on your soil. If you want to inoculate your soil with good healthy biology, you can spray on top of your plants, and that's going to be like a probiotic that's going to fight different kinds of fungus issues like mildews and stuff. It's just a really great spray. So you can see, there's all kinds of examples that just show, seedlings. That's a great thing to put on your seedlings, just because inoculate and get some good bacteria for your seedlings. Really easy. There's tons of like YouTube videos and stuff on how to actually make it. Like I said, you have to have some good quality finished compost. Put in a sock, aquarium pump. Add some molasses, some water, and just let it bubble. And just after a day or two, but you need to use it the same day that you turn off the bubbler, because it will go anaerobic if it just sits there for a couple of days. So don't turn it off until you're ready to actually use it, and then spray it. And a lot of people, like if you're inoculating your soil, you really only need to do this once. But a lot of people will make it every year because they want to like inoculate the tops of their plants and give them some probiotics. Different kinds of sprayers. We talked about all these different sprayers, before in different previous classes. And then the last part, this is going to be a real quick part, just a couple quick tips. And this is, again, we encourage a pathogen prevention approach. So just avoiding outside of eggshells, avoid any kind of dairies and meats and stuff, just because it gets putrid and things. Unless you're like got a really great system and you're monitoring it, you know what you're doing. But if not, just avoid all this stuff. It's just a big headache that you don't really need. Make sure you have proper circulation and drainage. If your compost is just sitting in a puddle of water, it's going to get anaerobic. It's going to have pathogens. It's going to get nasty. So you want to make sure, that's the best thing you could do, is just making sure that it has drainage and it's getting circulation. Either getting the compost bin off the ground or giving a nice, carbon layer on the bottom that's going to soak up and, it's going to stop any, doing those carbon nests, help out a lot. Monitoring if temperatures, if you're if you don't have to do this, but it's pretty cool. These compost thermometers are like $20-$30. It's just really cool. You can kind of see, like, especially when you get your temperatures up to like 140 and 50 degrees. It's kind of exciting. Definitely, it's a good way to kind of see, like, especially if you're composting, disease things and meats and stuff. You want to make sure you're in that 130 to 160 range as much as possible. Hygiene, the main thing is just like, you don't want to like, play around with compost and then not wash your hands and eat some food. You just want to have people wash their hands, especially little kids that are playing in bacteria and stuff. A lot of times, like, people worry about pathogens and stuff. Like a lot of that stuff, like I said, will break down into soil. But as you're handling it, especially like while it's still breaking down, you just want to wash your hands afterwards. A lot of times, if you're doing a really good job, you're going to have a steamy pile, or on really dry days, you're going to have like a lot of fungus on top. This is particularly for people that already have lung issues. You want to avoid, or for everyone, but mainly for people with lung issues. you want to avoid standing right in that steam. You don't want to inhale that steam. It's not the worst thing in the world, but yeah, you don't want to, especially like if you have already pre-existing lung issues, get some kind of mask or something if you're going to turn your compost pile, if you have a steaming compost pile. Same with fungus. If you have like dry funguses and stuff, just water it down, before you turn it. That way it's not going to go airborne and you're not going to like inhale. I mean, these aren't the worst things in the world, but you definitely don't want to, yeah, it's not something you really want to inhale. And if you're not sure about, it's a good idea, especially if you're not monitoring temperatures and stuff, and if you don't have the best compost pile. If you're top dressing things, you just want to give it a month before harvesting. So you don't, if you have some lettuce that's it's almost ready to harvest, you don't want to top dress it with some compost, just in case it has any kind of pathogens or stuff. You just want to give it a chance to everything to break down. So I might top dress some tomatoes are still growing and things like that, but greens like this is you don't want to top dress like greens like this. You want, or if you're not sure about your compost, you're like, I don't know, someone threw some meat in it, I'm not really sure, like it didn't get proper drainage. Just let it sit in a pile when it's done for a couple months and just let it naturally break down and age. And then whatever, like anything bad in there is going to break down, and then mix it into your compost. And yeah, if you do get some, like if you have an open wound and you get some infection from compost, just like take that seriously. Maybe you need some antibiotics and stuff like that. But yeah, wear gloves when you compost and things like that. Cool. So that's the rest of all that I got for the compost class. If I'll stick around for another a couple minutes if anyone's got any questions or any advice or suggestions. Again, like I mean I know it's a lot. I understand totally. I don't want to scare people away from composting, but I just want people to be intentional. If you're going to do food scraps, maybe join a cooperative and kind of learn some things, or just try to build the bin, build that rat-proof bin, and just be intentional. Or just don't do food scraps and just compost and things that aren't going to attract critters. But definitely, thank you all so much. Let me know if anyone's got any questions, and I will see. Yeah, I'll stick around for a little bit.
I have some questions I put in chat.
Oh, did I miss anything? Okay. Okay, so what's the best time to add compost before placing the seeds or seedlings? Well, compost, I mean, anytime. I mean, I always add some compost right before I plant. I'll spread the, it's nice to have a good 2-3 inch layer completely covering your garden if possible, or whatever you have, and then till it in or non-till it in. And then plant. But then throughout the year, if you have extra compost, you can top dress it, just top dress, spread compost around the base of different plants, and that will slowly nutrient. So I mean, you can add compost anytime you want. The only thing I would stay away from is adding compost to things that you're about to harvest. Like if you have some greens that you're about to harvest, just, don't add compost, just let it, just in case there's some, bad bacteria or something in there.
What if it's old compost? Still don't add it?
If it's all compost?
Old, O-L-D, old.
Old compost. Oh yeah. Yeah, I would just avoid adding that to anything that you're gonna harvest. I mean, that's actually a USDA standard. Like you're not allowed to add compost to it's like 3 months before they harvest it, and because that's a lot of manures and stuff. But I mean, if you have some old compost, it should be okay. But you just don't know, so I just avoid. Like I said, even if there's something bad in it, it's all going to break down in your soil anyways. But see, is there a group for vermiculture, hands-on experience for first time once the pandemic is over? You could definitely, I mean, I don't, there's a great, there's an organization called Loop Closing. It's a for-profit company that's like a compost consultant. They do really great, consulting and vermicompost classes. There's not a group, but I bet if you reached out to that new Google group that we started, the DC Urban Grower Network, you might, want to see if people want to start, kind of, helping each other out with vermicompost. And it's also really great, like, yeah, we just grabbed on some listserv. Someone was like, "I got all these extra worms, and I don't have enough space." So we just grabbed a whole bunch of worms like a couple weeks ago from somebody, and started another bin. So it's nice having be able to share all that stuff. Let's see, food scraps are good for wiggly worms. How much food scraps and what kind of scraps are best? So as we said, avoid like pungent things like onions or garlic or citrus. and just add add a little bit and then wait till they eat most of it before adding again. You don't want to overload or you'll start getting like smelly bins and stuff. Why only a cup of soil? Okay, to add more. Yeah, you can if you want. You just need a little bit of soil. It's just mainly just to prime the gizzards. And a lot of times they already come with some soil, so they're already primed. But it's not a huge deal. But yeah, you can add a little bit more, soil. That's you just don't want to fill it because they do like some soil as nesting, but you don't want to have fill it completely up with topsoil because it's just hard for them to move around in topsoil. But yeah, I just do a cup full. I mean, you don't need it, but it's okay to add a little bit more. If I miss any questions, you can unmute yourself and just ask the question.
I still have this question about, is forest soil like topsoil, or does the forest soil have lots of weed seedlings?
Yeah, no, I mean, forest soil is definitely different than topsoil. I mean, it's the same components, but it has like different biology, and definitely it has a lot more seeds in them, seed banks. A lot, I mean, all of our soil has seeds in them, especially, and like a lot of times it's just like, every time you mix up your soil, you expose more seeds and then they start growing. But topsoil generally, like, I mean, it doesn't have, if you buy like a bag of topsoil, it's generally I don't know if they sanitize their stuff, but there's not a whole lot of seeds in it. So that you will get more seeds with forest soil. But the big part of it is the biology. So there's more fungal heavy soils and more bacterial heavy soils. And your annual garden plants like tomatoes and peppers and stuff, they like very bacterial soils. I mean, it's all right if there's some good fungus in there, but they enjoy the bacteria. It helps them like get, make food more accessible. But in like forests, like your big woodier plants are more fungal based. A lot of your the longer lasting like trees and berry bushes and stuff, they actually have a better relationship with funguses, a lot of like mycorrhizas and things like that. So your forest, so it's like, I don't know if I wouldn't recommend like digging up a whole bunch of forest soil and then planting directly in that, because your annuals, like, I mean, I mainly just and plus like I wouldn't, yeah, that's, yeah, especially not leave no trace. I mean, yeah, that's not, yeah, you'll probably get a ticket for that. But just getting like a little handful of soil just to kind of inoculate with some of that funguses in your garden helps out a lot.
For the bedding for the wiggly worms, is leaf mulch just as good as shredded paper?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm using right now. It's just crumbled up leaves. I mean, you want to crumble them up a bunch. I think shredded paper kind of works a little better, but I have a whole bunch of leaves in my yard, so I just, yeah, chop them up a little bit, and that works as great bedding. And they'll eventually eat that too. And, okay, so if you have, are most seedlings okay to plant out in the garden if they have grown their second leaves? So when do you actually plant them out? Yeah, so well, two factors. One is the soil temperatures. So if you have cool weather stuff, you can definitely plant that stuff out right now, like your greens and your kales and brassicas. Warm weather stuff like your tomatoes and eggplants, you got to wait till about mid-May just for the soil to warm up. You need the soil to be 60 to 70 degrees. So you can get a soil thermometer to really, detect exactly when that's at. But if the temperature is right, and then you just want to know when is a good time to plant, the best time to plant is when the root ball is established. So if you can actually, very gently kind of tug the base of the seedling, and like the whole root ball comes out, or if it's a very delicate plant, maybe if you could just pull it out and it all stays the same. Like maybe you get like a spoon, and if you could pull it out and all the soil stays relatively in one ball, that's a good time to plant it. That definitely, you definitely want to wait till after at least the first leaves, up here, the first true leaves, which is the second leaves. The first leaves are the condyles. But usually at that point, I mean, you can get away with planting them, but I like to make sure the root ball is really established and healthy. So I'll wait a little bit until I have that root ball is solid. Sometimes I'm potting up. Like I planted my tomato seedlings too early, and I have like I mean, we're planting them out for some of our public gardens, and I have like a couple hundred, tomato seedlings. And I planted them in 2-inch pots, and now they're all overcrowding, and I just ran out of 4-inch pots, and I'm gonna have to pot everything up. So I wish I waited a couple weeks and planted them a little bit later, and then I could have planted them directly with their small root balls, because all the root balls are formed. It's just not warm enough for those tomatoes. So now I just ordered like 400 4-inch pots. I'm gonna have to spend a whole day potting them up, because they're not ready to bring out. So the timing is definitely good, for that stuff if you're not into potting up. But yeah, definitely. I was talking about peas and broccoli, Rob. Okay, yeah, those are good to go for sure. A lot of peas, you can just direct seed peas. They grow so quickly. I mean, it's great if you got a seedling, but yeah, you can direct seed them too. And broccoli, Rob, for sure, it's definitely good to go right now.
So if we have some seedlings that need to have the earth warmer, so we pot them up. Do we cover the pot so that they stay a little warm?
You can. I mean, mine are in greenhouse, so they're warm enough. Yeah, I think they're fine. I mean, it's the same. Yeah, this just I would keep them in the same situation that you were growing them before. I mean, they definitely need to be a little bit warm. Like that's why I'll use like heating pads just to germinate them, because a lot of times they need really warm soil to germinate. But usually after that, I'll take the pad out, because it's just going to dry out the soil quicker, and they're a little bit more tolerant once they germinate to the cold soil.
Well, I think I have to pot mine up because they grew in those newfangled kind of little baby greenhouses, but the greenhouse wasn't tall enough for them. So I had to open the greenhouse, and then I took them out, and I'll probably just have to plant new seeds.
Well, you can keep on potting them. I mean, yeah.
Keep on potting them, and
Yeah, the problem is you eventually lose room, you lose space. I mean, in worst case scenario, like if you got you've got no place to put them, just plant them in the ground and see what happens.
I
But
would think keep them covered because it's still cold. Keep
yeah, you can plant them in the ground, and build little mini, like out of like half-gallon jugs and stuff,
Yeah,
and put little mini greenhouses, and particularly for the nighttime. The daytime they should be okay, but at nighttime is when they could die.
yeah, okay. Mm.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Unless there's
Josh.
any other questions, I'll go ahead and end this meeting. Just a heads up. Remember, there'll be Webinex links. I'll send out real soon. We're getting off the Zoom platform. But thank you all so much.
What are we getting on to? Webinar?
Webinex or
Oh,
WebEx.
web-
I'll send an email to everybody
Thank
real
you.
soon.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks all. Stay safe.